What if I told you that one of the Bible's most notorious nations began with a scandalous act in a cave, grew into Israel's greatest tormentor, and ultimately faced divine judgment that echoes through eternity? From their shocking origins with Lot's daughters to their seductive warfare against Israel, from Balak's cursed schemes to their final prophetic doom, we're about to uncover every twist, betrayal, and divine intervention in this epic biblical saga that spans over 1,000 years. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? In the ancient lands where the sun sets behind jagged mountains, a story begins that will echo through thousands of years. A story that starts in darkness and shame, but carries within it the seeds of nations yet to be born. The cave sits silent now, carved into the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea's bitter waters. Here, in this hollow place, something happened that would shape the destiny of peoples for generations. The air inside still seems heavy, as if the weight of what occurred here refuses to lift. Lot's daughters huddle together in the dim light. Their world has ended. The cities they knew, the life they understood, the future they expected, all gone in fire and sulfur. Behind them lies only ash and memory. Before them stretches wilderness and uncertainty. They are the last of their kind, or so they believe. The older sister speaks first. Her words carry the desperation of someone who sees no tomorrow unless she creates it herself. "Our father grows old," she whispers. "There are no men left in all the earth to come to us according to the way of all the earth." The younger listens, fear mixing with something else in her eyes, a terrible understanding of what her sister proposes. Wine flows that night, ancient wine, perhaps saved from Sodom's destruction or traded from passing merchants. It matters little. What matters is the choice being made, the line being crossed, the future being shaped by hands that tremble as they pour. 2 nights pass this way, 2 choices made in darkness, 2 sons conceived in shame and desperation. The cave that shelters them becomes a womb of nations, but not nations blessed. Nations born from fear, from taking what was not given, from seeking life through means that carry death within them. The first son draws breath under stars that have watched empires rise and fall. His mother names him Moab, from father, a name that will never let him forget his origin. The second child, Ben-Ami, will father the Ammonites. But our story follows the first child, the one whose name carries both connection and corruption. From the moment of his birth, Moab carries something different. More than just the stain of his conception, he carries the tension between blessing and curse that will define his descendants. His grandfather Abraham received promises from the Almighty. His granduncle Lot chose the well-watered plains. Now, Moab inherits a legacy twisted by desperation and shame. The child grows strong in the wilderness. His eyes learn to read the subtle signs of water in dry places. His feet learn the paths between settlements. His hands learn to work the harsh soil of the eastern highlands. Yet something in his spirit remains restless, as if he knows he was born to be separate, to be other, to stand apart from the covenant line that flows through his distant relatives. As Moab becomes a man, he moves eastward, away from the lands that hold too many memories. The Jordan River becomes a boundary more than geographic. On one side lies the inheritance of Abraham's chosen line. On the other, Moab begins to build something new, a nation, a culture, a people who will define themselves partly by what they are not. The highlands east of the Dead Sea welcome him. These are lands of red stone and sudden storms, where wheat grows golden in hidden valleys and springs bubble up from deep places in the earth. Here, among the hills and plateaus, the Moabites learn to be a people. They develop their own tongue, their own customs, their own way of understanding the divine. Yet always, the memory of that cave lingers, passed down in whispers and warnings, in the way mothers look at their children when storms gather in the west. The Moabites know they are children of shame, and shame shapes a people differently than blessing does. It makes them hungry for honor, desperate to prove their worth, quick to see insult where none was meant. Years pass like seasons, and Moab the man becomes Moab the memory, but his descendants carry his name and his burden. They multiply in the eastern lands, building cities on hilltops and fortresses in valleys. They learned to work iron and bronze, to domesticate sheep and cattle, to trade with the caravans that passed through their territory carrying spices and precious stones. But always, always, there is the knowledge that somewhere to the west, beyond the Jordan, lives another branch of their family tree. The chosen ones, the blessed ones, the ones who carry promises instead of shame. This knowledge works in the Moabite soul like yeast in bread, causing it to rise but also to sour. Generations flow like water down mountain slopes. The descendants of Moab forget many things, the exact words spoken in that cave, the taste of Sodom's wine, the sound their ancestor's voice made when he first cried under foreign stars. But they remember the essential truth. They are connected to the covenant people, yet forever separate from them. They are family, yet enemies. They are chosen, yet cursed. This paradox becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Every alliance, every battle, every moment of peace or war between Moab and the children of Abraham will echo back to that cave, to those choices made in darkness, to the birth of a nation from desperate love and terrible need. The curse that started it all was not spoken by divine lips or carved in stone tablets. It was woven into the very fabric of Moab's beginning. The curse of being born from family, yet forever estranged from family, of carrying blessing in their bloodline, yet never being able to fully claim it, of knowing their worth, yet always wondering if others see only their shame. As the sun sets behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the Moabite highlands, the stage is set for everything that will follow. A people born from crisis, shaped by separation, destined to dance the complex dance of kinship and rivalry with their covenant cousins for generations yet to come. The cave falls silent again, but the story it birthed has only just begun. Lot's downfall. The road to Moab begins in Sodom. The morning sun climbs over Sodom's walls like hope rising from darkness. But hope has become a stranger in these streets. The city awakens to another day of plenty, built on foundations that crack a little deeper with each passing season. Few notice the subtle signs, the way children's laughter sounds forced, how merchants' eyes dart nervously between customer and door, the manner in which prayers are whispered rather than sung. Lot walks these familiar paths with the measured pace of a man who has found his place in the world, yet never quite convinced himself he belongs there. His house stands proud among the better dwellings, its courtyard filled with the sounds of prosperity, servants preparing meals, children at play, the gentle bleating of well-fed flocks in nearby pens. He has built something here, something substantial and lasting, or so it appears. The years in Sodom have been kind to Lot in the ways that matter most, to those who measure success by visible things. His herds have multiplied beyond counting. His household commands respect in the city's gates. His daughters have grown beautiful and wise, sought after by the young men of influential families. When he sits among the elders to hear disputes and render judgment, others listen with the attention due to a man whose counsel carries weight. Yet something gnaws at the edges of his contentment like a persistent wind wearing away stone. Letters arrive sometimes from his uncle Abraham, carried by dusty travelers who speak of altars built under open skies and promises received from the voice of the Almighty. These messages tell of a different kind of prosperity, flocks that multiply through divine blessing rather than careful breeding, protection that comes from covenant rather than city walls, wealth that flows from obedience rather than opportunity. Lot reads these letters in private, usually in the evening when the household settles into sleep. He studies each word, seeking something he cannot name. Abraham writes of walking with the divine presence, of conversations that reshape the soul, of a future stretching beyond the horizon like an unbroken promise. The words stir something deep in Lot's heart, a longing, perhaps, or maybe just the echo of what once was. But morning always comes, and with it the practical demands of life in Sodom. Business partnerships require attention. Social obligations must be met. The machinery of urban prosperity demands constant feeding with time and effort and careful compromise. Slowly, gradually, the stirring in his heart quiets until it becomes little more than background music, barely audible above the louder songs of daily life. The compromise begins small, as compromise always does. A word left unspoken when conversation turns to things that make his spirit uneasy. A practice overlooked when confronting it might cost him influence or friendship. A standard softened when holding firm might mean standing alone. Each compromise seems reasonable at the time, justified by circumstances or necessitated by wisdom. None of them, taken alone, appears significant enough to matter, but compromise accumulates like sediment in a river, slowly changing the channel until the water flows in directions never intended. Lot finds himself nodding along with conversations that would have horrified him years earlier. He participates in customs his conscience once rejected. He makes alliances with people whose values align poorly with the faith Abraham taught him, beside campfires under desert stars. His daughters watch their father navigate these waters with the sharp eyes of youth that sees everything but understands little. They learn from his example that faith is something private, something that bends rather than breaks, something that adapts to circumstances rather than shaping them. They absorb the lesson that belonging matters more than believing, that prosperity proves divine favor better than obedience demonstrates divine love. The city's influence seeps into Lot's household like water finding cracks in a foundation. His servants adopt the casual attitudes toward sacred things they observe in their master. His wife begins to find the old ways quaint rather than meaningful, suitable perhaps for desert nomads, but hardly practical for urban sophisticates. The very air they breathe seems charged with the assumption that Sodom's way is the progressive way, the enlightened way, the way of people who have moved beyond the simple certainties of an earlier age. Years pass this way, each one making the transformation seem more natural and less noticeable. Lot becomes a Sodomite who happens to remember Abraham rather than Abraham's nephew who happens to live in Sodom. The distinction might appear subtle, but it carries within it the difference between a temporary residence and a permanent identity, between being in the world and being of it. When divine messengers arrive at Sodom's gates, they find Lot sitting in the place of authority and influence he has worked so carefully to achieve. He recognizes them immediately. Something about their bearing, their faces, the way they carry themselves speaks of the world he once knew. His response is immediate and instinctive. He rises, bows deeply, and presses them to accept his hospitality with the urgency of a man who knows this may be his last connection to a life he traded away piece by piece. The feast he prepares for them that night is magnificent by Sodom's standards, but it tastes like dust in his mouth. Across the table, the messengers speak of judgment coming swift as summer lightning. They use words Lot has not heard in years. Words about righteousness and wickedness, about divine patience reaching its limit, about the inevitable harvest that follows a season of sowing corruption. Outside his door, the city reveals its true nature in ways that can no longer be ignored or explained away. The sounds that rise from the streets that night strip away every comfortable illusion Lot has built about the place he chose to call home. The compromise that seemed so reasonable in daylight shows its face in the darkness, and that face is ugly beyond description. Dawn brings messengers of mercy grasping his hands, pulling him toward a future he can barely comprehend. Behind him lies everything he built, everything he worked for, everything that defined his success in the world's terms. Ahead stretches uncertainty and loss and the terrible freedom of having no choice but to trust in promises he had almost forgotten how to believe. Lot's wife walks beside him for a while, but her heart remains behind with the life they are leaving. When she turns for one last look, she becomes a monument to the danger of loving the wrong things too deeply. Lot stumbles forward with his daughters, a man stripped of everything except life itself and the chance to begin again. The cave in the hills becomes their shelter, but it shelters more than just their bodies. It holds the bitter fruit of choices made in comfort and compromise, accepted in small degrees. It becomes the place where desperation births nations and shame becomes inheritance. The road to Moab begins in Sodom's gates, but it ends in that dark hollow where the future takes shape under the weight of a past that can never be undone. In losing Sodom, Lot loses more than a city. He loses the man he might have been, the father he intended to be, the legacy he planned to leave. What remains becomes the seed of something else entirely, a people born from the ashes of compromised dreams and the desperate hope that somehow, some way, life can emerge even from the ruins of our most tragic failures. The origins of the Moabites. a nation born in shame. The child born in that cave carries more than just the weight of his unusual conception. He carries the combined legacy of two ancient bloodlines, the blessing of Abraham flowing through his grandfather's veins, and the accumulated compromise that led his family to this dark beginning. From his first breath, Moab exists in the space between promise and failure, between divine favor and human frailty. His mother names him with deliberate intent. Moab, from father, a name that ensures he will never escape the circumstances of his birth. Yet in that very directness lies a kind of honesty that becomes characteristic of his descendants. The Moabites will never be a people who hide from hard truths or dress ugly realities in beautiful words. They know what they are and where they came from, and they build their identity on that unflinching knowledge. As the boy grows, the hills east of the Salt Sea become his classroom and playground. These are lands that demand strength from their inhabitants. Red stone country where water must be carefully sought and fiercely protected, where the margin between survival and disaster remains always thin. The landscape shapes the child as surely as genetics and upbringing, teaching him to read the subtle signs that mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. His aunt, Lot's younger daughter, bears her son Ben-Ami in the same season. The two boys grow up together, cousins born under the same strange star, sharing the same complicated heritage. They learn to hunt in the same valleys, to find water in the same hidden springs, to recognize the plants that heal and the ones that harm. Yet from early childhood, differences emerge between them that hint at the separate destinies awaiting their descendants. Moab shows himself drawn to the high places, the rocky outcroppings that offer views across the Jordan Valley to the western lands, the wind-swept plateaus where a man can stand and feel himself master of all he surveys. There is something in his nature that seeks elevation, both physical and spiritual. Even as a child, he builds small altars of stacked stones where he burns offerings to the divine powers he senses moving through his world. The rituals he develops are his own creation, not learned from any tradition or inherited from any teacher. They blend half-remembered fragments of Abraham's faith, filtered through his mother's imperfect understanding, with his own intuitive sense of the sacred. The resulting practices carry both truth and distortion, light and shadow, in proportions that will shape his descendants' spirituality for centuries to come. As Moab reaches manhood, others begin to gather around him. Wandering groups, displaced families, younger sons seeking their fortunes, the eastern highlands attract those who find no place in the settled lands to the west. Some come fleeing debt or shame, others drawn by stories of a new leader who welcomes all comers, regardless of their past. Moab's own origin story makes him naturally sympathetic to those who carry burdens they cannot shed. The early Moabite settlements reflect this mixed heritage. They build their homes strong and defensible, learning from harsh experience that survival depends on vigilance. Their fields are carefully terraced to catch every drop of precious rainfall. Their flocks are hardy breeds that can thrive on sparse vegetation and bitter water. Everything about their early culture speaks of a people determined to make permanent homes in lands others consider barely habitable. Yet alongside this practical adaptation runs a deeper current of spiritual searching that sets them apart from neighboring peoples. The Moabites develop elaborate ceremonies around the turning of seasons, complex rituals for blessing crops and flocks, intricate systems of divination and prophecy. They seem driven by a hunger to understand the divine will, to position themselves rightly in relation to the cosmic forces that govern life and death, prosperity and disaster. This spiritual intensity carries within it both genuine seeking and dangerous distortion. The blessing of Abraham's line manifests in the Moabites as a real sensitivity to divine things, an authentic desire to worship and serve higher powers. But the circumstances of their origin introduce complications that twist even their most sincere efforts into problematic directions. They begin to see themselves as a people chosen for a special destiny, but chosen to stand in opposition to, rather than cooperation with their covenant cousins. They understand themselves as recipients of divine favor, but favor earned through their own efforts rather than received as gracious gift. They develop a theology that justifies their separation from the Western lands while simultaneously nurturing resentment about that separation. The god they call Chemosh emerges from these mixed spiritual currents as both protector and judge, both provider and demanding master. Chemosh loves the Moabites with fierce tribal loyalty, but that love expresses itself through requirements that grow more extreme and costly with each generation. What begins as simple offerings of grain and oil evolves toward practices that will eventually horrify even pagans from other nations. Trade routes begin to develop through Moabite territory as the tribe grows into a people and the people mature into a nation. Caravans carrying precious goods between Egypt and Mesopotamia find the highland roads safer and more direct than the coastal alternatives. The Moabites learn to tax this traffic skillfully, providing protection and supplies in exchange for regular tribute that slowly builds their wealth and influence. Contact with these traders brings new ideas, new technologies, new ways of understanding the world. The Moabites prove eager students, adopting improved methods of metalworking, agriculture, and warfare, with the enthusiasm of a people determined to prove themselves equal to any challenge. Their cities grow larger and more impressive, their armies better equipped and more disciplined, their leaders more sophisticated in diplomacy and statecraft. Yet prosperity and progress cannot erase the fundamental tension at the heart of Moabite identity. They remain the children of shame, the nation born from desperate compromise, the people who carry blessing in their bloodline but cannot seem to access it fully. Every achievement feels like compensation for their origin, every success like an argument against their past, every moment of pride shadowed by the memory of that cave where it all began. As news arrives of developments in the Western lands, of a people called out of Egypt, of divine plagues and supernatural deliverances, of a nation being formed from former slaves under the leadership of one called Moses, the Moabites watch with complex emotions. Envy mixes with fear, curiosity with resentment, hope with dread. Their covenant cousins are finally claiming their inheritance, and the Moabites know their own destiny will somehow be shaped by that claiming. The mature Moabite nation that emerges from these early centuries carries all the complexity of its origin story. They are a people capable of remarkable loyalty and terrible cruelty, of profound spiritual insight and devastating moral blindness, of generous hospitality and implacable hatred. They represent both the best and worst possibilities of what humans become when they try to create meaning and purpose apart from the divine plan that shaped their ancestors. Standing on their high places as the sun sets behind the western mountains, Moabite priests offer sacrifices that rise like prayers into the darkening sky. They do not know that across the Jordan, their relatives are preparing for a journey that will bring these two branches of Abraham's family tree into direct conflict. They cannot foresee the coming collision between their hard-won independence and their cousins' divine mandate. But they sense something approaching in the wind that blows from the desert, something that will test every assumption they have built their identity upon, challenge every story they have told themselves about their worth and their place in the cosmic order. The nation born in shame is about to discover whether shame can be transformed through effort and will, or whether some origins cast shadows too deep for any human light to penetrate. The stage is set for a confrontation that will echo through history, a meeting between peoples who share too much blood to ignore each other, yet carry too much hurt to embrace. In that meeting, the true meaning of Moab's birth will finally be revealed, not as the end of their story, but as its strange and troubled beginning. Moab in the shadows, life before the Exodus. In the generations before the world heard of Moses or marveled at Egypt's plagues, the Moabites built their civilization in the steady rhythm of seasons and years, unmarked by dramatic divine interventions. Theirs became a story written in stone terraces carved from hillsides, in copper mines dug deep into mountain hearts, in trading posts that sprouted like flowers along the caravan routes crossing their highlands. The descendants of Moab learned to read their landscape with the intimate knowledge that comes only from staying in one place long enough to understand its moods and seasons. They discovered that the red sandstone cliffs held hidden springs if you knew where to listen for the sound of water moving through rock. They found that certain valleys caught morning mist in ways that made them perfect for growing grapes, while others faced the sun just right for ripening grain even in dry years. Their cities rose naturally from the contours of the land, built where defensible heights offered protection while remaining close to water sources and fertile ground. Moab, their greatest stronghold, crowned a steep-sided plateau that commanded views in every direction. Its walls seemed to grow from the living rock, massive blocks fitted together with the precision that comes from generations of master builders refining their craft. Within these walls, Moabite culture developed its own distinctive patterns. Their craftsmen became known throughout the region for metalwork that combined strength with beauty, bronze tools that held their edge through years of use, ornamental vessels that caught and reflected light in ways that seemed almost magical to foreign visitors. Their weavers created textiles whose rich colors came from dyes extracted from highland plants found nowhere else, fabrics prized by merchants willing to travel weeks to obtain them. The Moabite language evolved its own rhythms and expressions, borrowing words from the many tongues spoken by traders passing through their territory, while maintaining grammatical structures that reflected their unique way of understanding the world. Their poetry carried the cadences of mountain wind and desert storm. Their storytelling traditions preserved memories that reached back to the earliest days of their settlement in the Eastern Highlands. Music held special significance in Moabite society, perhaps because a people born from such complicated circumstances needed the healing that comes from harmony and rhythm. Their instruments reflected the materials their land provided. Drums made from carefully cured sheepskin, stretched over frames of desert hardwood, flutes carved from the hollow bones of large birds that migrated through their territory each spring, stringed instruments whose bodies were shaped from gourds grown in their most sheltered valleys. Their religious practices centered around the high places, natural or constructed elevated sites, where they believed the boundary between earthly and divine realms grew thin. These sacred locations dotted the Moabite landscape like stars scattered across the night sky, each one serving particular purposes in the complex web of ritual and ceremony that governed their spiritual lives. Chemosh, their national deity, received the most elaborate worship, but the Moabite pantheon included numerous lesser powers responsible for specific aspects of life: gods of the harvest, goddesses of childbirth, spirits that governed weather patterns and protected travelers. The rituals developed to honor these divine beings grew increasingly complex as Moabite priests elaborated theological systems designed to explain and control the forces that shaped their world. Agriculture formed the foundation of Moabite prosperity, but their location along major trade routes provided opportunities for wealth that went far beyond what their fields and flocks could produce. They learned to serve as middlemen between the great civilizations of their era, providing safe passage and essential services to merchant caravans while extracting tribute that funded their growing ambitions. Egyptian gold flowed through Moabite hands on its way to northern markets, along with ivory from Africa, precious stones from Arabia, cedar wood from the northern mountains, and spices from lands so distant that their names existed only in the stories told by well-traveled merchants. The Moabites developed sophisticated systems for evaluating, storing, and transporting these valuable goods, becoming experts in the complex negotiations required for successful long-distance trade. Their military evolved in response to the dual requirements of protecting their trade interests and defending their territory from raiders who saw their prosperity as an attractive target. Moabite warriors became known for their skill with swords and spears, forged from iron. They learned to work in furnaces, fired with charcoal made from highland timber. Their cavalry, mounted on horses, bred for endurance in rocky terrain, could strike swiftly at enemies and disappear into country they knew better than any outsider ever could. The political structure that emerged to govern this growing prosperity balanced tribal traditions with the more complex requirements of managing trade relationships and international diplomacy. Kings ruled from Moab, but their power was checked by councils of elders representing the various clans and trading guilds that formed the backbone of Moabite society. These rulers faced the constant challenge of maintaining Moabite independence while navigating the dangerous currents of great power politics that swirled around their small nation. Egypt's influence waxed and waned according to the strength of its current dynasty. Mesopotamian empires rose and fell, each one briefly extending its reach into the Levantine highlands before being replaced by the next ambitious ruler. The Moabites learned to bend without breaking, to pay tribute when necessary, while preserving their essential autonomy. Their diplomatic correspondence, preserved in archives carved into cliff faces and fired clay tablets, reveals a people skilled at playing larger powers against each other while avoiding the kind of definitive commitments that might prove costly when political winds shifted. They mastered the art of being valuable enough to protect, but not threatening enough to conquer, useful enough to court, but not wealthy enough to provoke direct annexation. Education in Moabite society emphasized practical skills alongside cultural preservation. Children learned to read and write using systems adapted from various neighboring civilizations, but the texts they studied included distinctly Moabite wisdom literature, legal codes, and religious poetry. Boys training for leadership studied not only their own traditions, but also the languages and customs of the peoples they might someday need to negotiate with as adults. Women in Moabite society enjoyed relatively high status, perhaps because their foundational story involved the initiative taken by Lot's daughters in ensuring their family's survival. Priestesses served important functions in religious ceremonies, particularly those associated with fertility and the agricultural cycle. Merchant families often entrusted their trading operations to capable daughters when sons showed less aptitude for commerce. The arts flourished in this atmosphere of prosperity and cultural confidence. Moabite sculptors created works that combined influences from many traditions while expressing distinctly local sensibilities. Their pottery showed technical excellence in both functional and decorative pieces, often featuring geometric patterns that reflected their highland environment's natural forms and colors. Yet beneath all this visible success ran deeper currents of spiritual searching and cultural anxiety that reflected their unique position as a people who knew themselves to be both blessed and cursed, chosen and rejected, connected to great promises they could not fully claim. Moabite literature preserved in temple libraries reveals a people wrestling with questions about divine justice, national destiny, and the meaning of suffering that goes beyond what material prosperity can address. Their prophets and wise men developed sophisticated theological explanations for their nation's peculiar status, theories that portrayed Moab as chosen for a special role that required separation from rather than integration with their covenant cousins. These teachings helped justify their independence while providing frameworks for understanding the complex emotions that arose whenever news arrived from the Western lands where Abraham's other descendants lived and struggled. As the generations passed and Egypt's power over Hebrew slaves grew more oppressive, Moabite observers watched with interest but little direct concern. The sufferings of distant relatives seemed like problems belonging to another world, relevant to their own situation only as they might affect trade routes or regional stability. They had built something substantial and lasting in their highland refuge, something that seemed secure enough to endure whatever changes might sweep across the broader ancient Near East. But security built on human effort and political calculation, however skillful, remains vulnerable to forces beyond human control or prediction. In Egypt, a Hebrew child hidden among river reeds was growing into manhood with a divine calling that would reshape the entire region's balance of power. The Moabites, comfortable in their mountain strongholds, could not yet imagine how profoundly their carefully constructed world was about to change. The shadows that had sheltered their development were beginning to shift as divine purposes long held in abeyance prepared to move into the full light of history. The people born from shame in a hillside cave were about to discover whether their centuries of achievement had prepared them to face the covenant people whose destiny they shared but could not escape. The Exodus and the coming storm news travels slowly in the ancient world, carried by traders and wandering storytellers, whose accounts grow more elaborate with each telling. But some stories arrive with the unmistakable weight of truth. carrying details too strange to be invented and consequences too serious to ignore. Such are the reports that begin filtering into Moabite territory from the direction of Egypt, stories of plagues that defy natural explanation, of a people walking free from centuries of bondage, of divine power moving visibly through human affairs. At first, the Moabites received these accounts with the skeptical interest they might show toward any exotic tale from distant lands. Egypt has always been a source of fascinating stories, tales of god kings and massive monuments, of ritual mysteries and political intrigues. The idea that Hebrew slaves might have somehow escaped their masters seems no more remarkable than any other political upheaval in that ancient and complicated kingdom. But the reports keep coming, and they share certain details that become impossible to dismiss. Water turning to blood throughout an entire river system, darkness thick enough to touch, covering the land for 3 days, the sudden death of every firstborn child and animal in a single night. These are not the kinds of details that emerge from normal political unrest or military conquest. They speak of intervention by powers that dwarf human understanding. King Sihon of Heshbon, whose territory borders Moabite lands to the north, sends urgent messages seeking information and counsel. His scouts report massive movements of people in the desert regions between Egypt and Canaan, not the scattered migration of nomadic tribes seeking new pastures, but the organized march of a nation on the move. Estimates of numbers vary wildly, but even the most conservative suggest a population far larger than anything the Eastern Highlands have ever seen. Moabite intelligence networks, carefully cultivated through generations of trade relationships, begin gathering more specific information about this Hebrew exodus. The people involved are indeed the descendants of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, whose family had settled in Egypt during a time of famine centuries earlier. They had multiplied there beyond anyone's expectations, eventually becoming so numerous that Egyptian rulers feared they might join with enemies in times of war. The leader of this Hebrew liberation appears to be a man named Moses, someone with connections to both Hebrew and Egyptian cultures, but claiming to speak with direct divine authority. The reports describe him as performing signs and wonders that convinced not only his own people, but even Pharaoh's court of his supernatural backing. The plagues that devastated Egypt came at his word, and the final exodus occurred when he promised divine protection for the Hebrew families who followed specific ritual instructions. More disturbing to Moabite ears are the reports of what happened at the Sea of Reeds when Pharaoh's army attempted to prevent the Hebrew departure. Witnesses describe waters parting to create a dry pathway, then crashing back together to destroy pursuing chariots and cavalry. The very forces of nature seem to be aligned with Hebrew interests in ways that suggest purposes far beyond ordinary political liberation. As these extraordinary stories settle into Moabite consciousness, their implications become increasingly clear. The Hebrews are not simply another displaced population seeking new homes in the sparsely settled regions east of Jordan. They are a people claiming divine mandate to occupy specific territories that include lands the Moabites consider their own sphere of influence. The coming storm will not pass harmlessly by, leaving Moabite interests untouched. King Balak, who rules from the fortress city of Kir Moab, calls his advisors together to consider their nation's response to these developments. The discussions that follow reveal deep divisions within Moabite leadership about how to interpret the Hebrew claims and what strategy might best preserve Moabite independence. Some counsel immediate military preparation, arguing that early resistance offers the best hope of stopping Hebrew expansion before it gains unstoppable momentum. Others advocate diplomatic solutions, suggesting that accommodation with the Hebrew nation might serve Moabite interests better than armed opposition. After all, both peoples claim descent from Abraham, and family relationships sometimes provide foundations for mutual arrangements. Perhaps tribute or territorial concessions might purchase peace with these divinely favored cousins. A third faction urges spiritual consultation before making any definitive response. The Hebrew success in Egypt clearly involved supernatural intervention, and wisdom suggests learning more about the divine powers supporting them before choosing to stand in opposition. Moabite priests are dispatched to their high places to perform divination rituals that might reveal divine will regarding the approaching crisis. The results of these spiritual inquiries prove troubling and ambiguous. Some omens suggest that resistance to the Hebrew advance will bring disaster upon Moab. Others seem to promise divine support for Moabite effort in their homeland. The competing interpretations reflect the complex theological position Moab has always occupied, connected to covenant blessing through their Abrahamic lineage, yet separated from it through the circumstances of their origin and the choices made by their ancestors. While Moabite leaders debate strategy, practical preparations for conflict begin throughout territory. Weapons are sharpened and increased in number through intensive work in smithies that burn day and night. Food supplies are gathered and stored in fortified locations that might sustain populations through extended sieges. Alliances are strengthened with neighboring peoples who share Moabite concerns about Hebrew expansion. The Ammonites, descendants of Ben-Ami and thus Moab's closest relatives, prove natural partners in these defensive preparations. Their territory lies directly in the path the Hebrews must take if they intend to approach Canaan from the east, making armed conflict virtually inevitable unless accommodation can be reached. Combined Moabite and Ammonite forces represent a significant military challenge that might give even a divinely supported enemy cause for concern. Messengers race between the capitals of various small nations throughout the eastern highlands, carrying proposals for broader coalitions against the Hebrew threat. The Edomites, descendants of Esau and thus also related to the approaching people, face similar choices about resistance or accommodation. Their decisions will significantly influence the strategic options available to Moab and its allies. Intelligence reports about Hebrew numbers and military capabilities grow more detailed as the migrating nation moves closer to territories where Moabite interests are directly involved. The picture that emerges is both encouraging and disturbing to those planning Moabite resistance. The Hebrews travel with all their possessions, flocks, families, elderly relatives, and young children, suggesting they are not primarily organized for rapid military movement. Such a massive civilian population should be vulnerable to attack by mobile forces familiar with local terrain. Yet the same reports describe Hebrew military successes against other opponents they have encountered during their desert wanderings. Their fighters seem disciplined and well coordinated, led by commanders who combine tactical skill with absolute conviction about the righteousness of their cause. Moreover, their victories often involve circumstances that suggest supernatural assistance, sudden changes in weather that favor Hebrew forces, enemy armies that seem to defeat themselves through confusion and panic, supply problems that resolve themselves through unexpected discoveries of food and water. The psychological impact of these stories on Moabite populations proves as significant as their military implications. A people can prepare for war against human enemies using familiar strategies of alliance, fortification, and tactical planning. But how does one prepare for conflict with opponents who claim divine backing and seem to receive it in measurable ways? The very foundations of normal military calculation begin to shift when supernatural factors must be included in strategic planning. Religious leaders throughout Moab find themselves facing questions they have never been forced to address directly. Their theology has always acknowledged the existence of powerful divine beings beyond their national deity, Chemosh. But the Hebrew claims suggest a level of divine involvement in human affairs that challenges fundamental assumptions about how the cosmic order operates. If the Hebrew God truly possesses the power attributed to him, what does that mean for other divine beings and the peoples who serve them? Some Moabite priests begin developing theological explanations that might preserve their nation's spiritual confidence while acknowledging Hebrew's supernatural advantages. Perhaps the Hebrew deity's power is limited to specific geographical regions or particular types of intervention. Perhaps their recent successes represent temporary divine favor that will eventually be withdrawn when their moral behavior fails to meet divine standards. Perhaps Chemosh is simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to demonstrate his own power against these Hebrew invaders. Yet, even these hopeful interpretations cannot entirely quiet the deeper fears that arise from contemplating the Hebrew Exodus story. The plagues that devastated Egypt targeted that nation's gods as well as its people, demonstrating divine power that transcended normal boundaries between competing spiritual systems. The waters of the Sea of Reeds obeyed Hebrew commands while destroying Egyptian forces, suggesting authority over natural elements that extends far beyond local influence. These are not the kinds of limited divine interventions that fit comfortably within traditional theological frameworks. As spring turns towards summer and Hebrew movements bring them ever closer to territories where Moabite interests cannot be ignored, King Balak faces the most difficult decision of his reign. Traditional wisdom counsels against fighting enemies whose divine backing appears so formidable. Yet yielding without resistance might invite Hebrew demands that grow progressively more costly as they discover how easily Moabite will can be broken. The choice becomes more urgent as reports arrive describing Hebrew interactions with other peoples blocking their intended route toward Canaan. Some groups receive safe passage in exchange for reasonable accommodations, permission to purchase food and water, guarantees of peaceful transit through their territory, agreements not to settle permanently in lands already claimed by others. But peoples who refuse these requests or attack Hebrew forces face complete destruction, with a thoroughness that suggests policy rather than mere military necessity. Moabite observers begin to understand that they are witnessing the implementation of a divine mandate that allows for only limited human choice in response. Accommodation with Hebrew demands offers survival, though perhaps at costs that might prove difficult to bear. Resistance promises disaster, though the manner and timing of that disaster remain unclear. Neither option preserves the status quo that has served Moabite interests so well for generations. The approaching storm carries within it the potential to reshape the entire political and spiritual landscape of the Eastern Highlands. Peoples who have coexisted for centuries as neighbors and trading partners now find themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict whose outcome could determine their future existence. The balance of power that has allowed small nations to maintain independence through careful diplomacy faces disruption by forces that operate according to different rules entirely. Balak's scouts report that the Hebrew multitude has begun moving in formations that suggest they are preparing for the next phase of their journey toward their promised inheritance. The period of desert wandering that followed their Egyptian liberation appears to be drawing toward a close. Soon they will begin claiming territories they believe their God has promised to them, and that claiming will require displacing current inhabitants who have their own claims based on generations of occupation and development. The storm that began with Hebrew slaves crying out under Egyptian oppression is about to break over the highlands east of Jordan with force that will test every assumption Moab has built its civilization upon. The people born in a cave from desperate compromise are about to discover whether their centuries of achievement have prepared them to weather divine judgment, or whether their fundamental separation from covenant blessing leaves them defenseless against covenant power. In the distance, dust clouds on the horizon mark the approach of a nation that carries within itself both promise and threat, blessing and curse, hope for some and terror for others. The Moabites watch from their mountain strongholds, knowing that their response to what approaches will determine whether their name survives in history as a cautionary tale or disappears entirely beneath the advancing tide of Hebrew destiny. The coming storm will reveal which foundations can withstand divine purpose and which crumble when tested by forces beyond human strength to resist. For Moab, the test approaches with the inexorable certainty of dawn following darkness, carrying within it the final resolution of tensions that began in that cave where their ancestor first drew breath under foreign stars. King Balak and the prophet for hire. Fear moves through the highland fortress of Kir Moab like winter wind through mountain passes, invisible but unmistakable in its effects. King Balak walks the walls of his stronghold at dawn, his eyes scanning the eastern horizon, where dust clouds have been visible for 3 days now. The Hebrew multitude draws closer with each passing hour, and with them comes a crisis that will test every assumption upon which Moabite power rests. The king's advisors have provided him with detailed intelligence about this approaching nation. Their numbers exceed anything seen in the region within living memory, perhaps 600,000 fighting men, plus their families, herds, and possessions. They move with the disciplined organization of a people united by shared purpose and divine mandate. Most disturbing of all, they carry with them an aura of supernatural favor that has allowed them to overcome obstacles that should have been impossible to surmount. Balak has heard the stories repeatedly now, each telling adding new details that make them more rather than less believable. Water drawn from solid rock to refresh a thirsty multitude, food appearing each morning like dew across their camp, sustaining hundreds of thousands for months on end, enemies larger and better equipped than themselves falling before Hebrew forces, with a consistency that suggests more than human explanation. The political calculation appears straightforward, but terrifying. Direct military confrontation with this Hebrew nation would be suicide for Moab, regardless of how many allies might be gathered for the effort. Their numerical advantage alone would overwhelm any coalition the Eastern Highlands could assemble. Add to that their apparent divine backing, and resistance becomes not merely futile, but potentially catastrophic for any people brave or foolish enough to attempt it. Yet, yielding without resistance carries its own dangers. A king who surrenders his nation's independence without even attempting to defend it invites challenges from his own nobles and perhaps invasion from other neighbors who interpret such weakness as opportunity. Moreover, the Hebrew demands might prove so costly that accommodation becomes impossible to maintain over time, leading to conflict under even less favorable circumstances. Balak finds himself trapped between choices that promise disaster through different paths. Traditional military solutions offer only the certainty of defeat. Diplomatic options remain unexplored because the Hebrews have not yet made specific demands, leaving Moabite negotiators without clear parameters for potential agreements. The situation calls for unconventional approaches to problems that exceed normal political categories. In this extremity, Balak's thoughts turn towards supernatural solutions. If the Hebrew advantage stems from divine backing, perhaps divine intervention on Moab's behalf might level the balance of power. The king's knowledge of regional spiritual practices includes awareness of seers and diviners whose reputations extend far beyond their immediate territories. Among these, one name stands out for the remarkable scope of his alleged abilities. Balaam, son of Beor, dwells in the northern regions near the Great River, where he has built a reputation that spans multiple kingdoms and cultures. Unlike local priests tied to specific deities or territories, Balaam claims universal spiritual authority, the ability to communicate with divine powers regardless of their national or tribal associations. More importantly, for Balak's current purposes, Balaam's reputation includes successful curses that have brought disaster upon his client's enemies. The stories told about Balaam's power suggest exactly the kind of intervention Moab needs in its current crisis. Cities that scorned his warnings have fallen to plague or earthquake. Armies that marched against his clients have met defeat through sudden panic or supply failures. Kings who refused his counsel have lost their thrones to rivals who proved more receptive to his spiritual insights. Whether through authentic supernatural ability or remarkable skill at reading political and natural trends, Balaam's record of successful predictions and effective interventions has made him the most sought-after diviner in the region. Yet Balaam's services come at a price that reflects his unique position and proven abilities. His fees exceed what most rulers can afford for ordinary consultations, and his demands for specific forms of payment often include requirements that test his client's commitment to following his guidance. More challenging still, Balaam refuses to accept commissions unless his initial divination suggests that success is possible. He has built his reputation partly by avoiding association with doomed causes that might tarnish his image of supernatural effectiveness. King Balak faces the delicate task of approaching this expensive and selective prophet with a request that might appear desperate enough to invite refusal or exploitation. The message he crafts must convey the urgency of Moab's situation while suggesting that employment by a highland king offers Balaam opportunities worthy of his talents and reputation. The commission must seem attractive enough to interest someone who commands the attention of greater kingdoms, yet specific enough to indicate serious intent rather than mere panic. The embassy Balak assembles to carry his offer reflects the importance he places on securing Balaam's services. Leading Moabite nobles join with prominent Midianite allies in a delegation whose composition demonstrates that multiple kingdoms support this initiative. They carry gifts valuable enough to show respect for Balaam's status, yet carefully chosen to suggest that much greater rewards await if the seer's intervention proves successful. The message they bear combines flattery with urgency in proportions calculated to motivate without appearing manipulative. Balak acknowledges Balaam's reputation while describing the Hebrew threat in terms designed to appeal to someone whose livelihood depends on helping clients overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The proposed fee structure promises immediate payment for consultation, plus substantial bonuses tied to measurable results in weakening Hebrew progress toward Moabite territory. Yet, beneath the diplomatic language and careful calculations runs a current of genuine desperation that reflects how completely the Hebrew approach has disrupted traditional patterns of regional politics. Balak is not simply seeking another tool in the normal arsenal of military and diplomatic options. He is reaching for supernatural intervention because natural alternatives appear inadequate to address the crisis facing his kingdom. The decision to employ Balaam represents more than tactical expedience. It reflects a fundamental shift in how Moab understands its position in the cosmic order. For generations, Moabite kings have relied on their own strength, their alliances, and their patron deity Chemosh to protect and advance their national interests. Now Balak finds himself seeking help from a foreign diviner whose power stems from sources outside the traditional spiritual systems that have guided Moabite policy. This shift carries theological implications that extend far beyond immediate military concerns. By hiring Balaam, Balak implicitly acknowledges that the divine powers supporting the Hebrew advance may exceed what Moab's traditional religious resources can counter. The move represents both practical wisdom and spiritual compromise, an admission that Moabite theology may be inadequate to address the challenges posed by Hebrew covenant claims. The irony of this situation would not be lost on observers familiar with Moab's origins and history. A people whose ancestor was born from Lot's separation from Abraham's covenant line now finds itself forced to seek supernatural assistance against Abraham's other descendants. The separation that began in a cave east of Sodom has led to a confrontation where Moab must hire foreign spiritual expertise to defend against relatives whose divine backing they cannot match through their own resources. As Balak's embassy travels northward, carrying offers and entreaties to the famous seer, the king returns to his walls to watch the approaching Hebrew dust clouds. The political and military preparations for confrontation continue, but increasingly they feel like gestures made more from habit than hope. The real defense of Moab now rests in the hands of a prophet whose reputation exceeds his reliability, whose power remains unproven against opponents who claim direct divine mandate for their actions. The highland fortress that has protected Moabite independence for generations suddenly feels fragile as morning mist, vulnerable to forces that operate according to rules Balak cannot fully understand or counter through conventional means. His kingdom's survival may depend on whether a hired prophet can accomplish what armies and alliances cannot, turning back a nation that marches under divine protection toward an inheritance they believe their God has promised them. In seeking supernatural help against supernatural opposition, Balak has set in motion events whose consequences will extend far beyond his immediate crisis. The collision between Hebrew destiny and Moabite desperation is about to produce encounters that will reveal the true nature of divine power and the limits of human schemes to redirect it toward ends of their own choosing. The talking donkey and divine interference. The morning sun climbs above the eastern mountains as Balaam prepares for his journey south toward the land of Moab. His servants load pack animals with the supplies and ceremonial items required for the complex divination rituals King Balak has commissioned. The gold and silver carried by Balak's messengers gleam in the early light, tangible evidence of how desperately the Moabite king needs supernatural intervention against the Hebrew threat approaching his territory. Balaam's reputation rests on his ability to discern divine will and influence supernatural forces on behalf of clients willing to pay his substantial fees. Kings and princes throughout the region seek his counsel because his track record of accurate predictions and effective interventions exceeds that of any rival practitioner. Yet this commission presents unusual challenges that make even an experienced diviner cautious about guaranteeing specific outcomes. The Hebrew people, marching toward Moabite territory, carry with them divine backing that manifests in ways Balaam has never encountered in his extensive career. Their liberation from Egypt involved supernatural interventions that devastated one of the ancient world's greatest kingdoms. Their survival in the desert depends on miraculous provisions that sustain hundreds of thousands of people in lands where a few dozen would normally struggle to find adequate food and water. During the previous evening's divination session, Balaam received divine communication that left him troubled and uncertain. The spiritual realm revealed competing currents of purpose that suggested this Hebrew commission involves forces beyond normal categories of blessing and cursing. Divine beings whose authority exceeds regional or national boundaries appear to be directly involved in Hebrew affairs, making outside intervention problematic in ways that could endanger any seer bold enough to attempt it. Yet the fees offered by King Balak represent the largest commission of Balaam's career, enough wealth to secure comfortable retirement or fund expansion of his operations to serve even greater kingdoms. The temptation to accept such lucrative employment remains strong despite the spiritual warnings that counsel caution. Perhaps careful ritual preparation and appropriate sacrificial offerings might provide protection for an experienced diviner attempting to work against divinely favored opponents. Balaam's white donkey, a reliable animal that has carried him safely through years of travel to distant consultations, seems unusually restless this morning. The creature shifts nervously as harness and saddle are adjusted, its ears turning constantly as if listening for sounds its rider cannot detect. Such behavior is unusual for an animal known for steady temperament and reliable response to familiar routines. The road southward toward Moab follows ancient trading routes that wind through valleys and across ridges in the highland country between the great river and the desert regions where the Hebrew multitude camps. These paths have carried Balaam to previous consultations without incident, but today the journey feels different from its first steps. The very air seems charged with tension that makes both animal and rider alert to dangers that remain invisible but somehow present. The sun climbs higher as the small caravan makes steady progress along familiar paths. Balaam rides in comfortable contemplation of the wealth awaiting him in Moab, reviewing in his mind the ritual procedures he will employ to accomplish King Balak's objectives. The divination required for cursing an entire nation exceeds normal practice in scope and complexity, but his experience and reputation justify confidence in eventual success. Without warning, the donkey stops abruptly in the middle of the path, its entire body trembling with fear of something only it can perceive. Balaam urges the animal forward with voice and heel, but the creature refuses to move despite increasingly harsh commands. Its eyes remain fixed on empty air ahead, as if seeing obstacles that block the way, though the path appears completely clear to human vision. Frustrated by this unexpected delay when urgency demands swift travel, Balaam strikes the donkey with his staff to force obedience. The animal responds by lurching sideways off the main path into a vineyard, crushing Balaam's foot against a stone wall in its panic to avoid whatever threatens from ahead. The pain and inconvenience of this detour add anger to the diviner's frustration with his normally reliable mount. He beats the donkey again, more severely this time, until it returns reluctantly to the path and resumes southward travel. But the animal's behavior remains erratic, its attention focused on threats that exist beyond human perception. Every few steps bring renewed signs of fear, ears flattened, muscles tense, occasional trembling that speaks of terror, carefully controlled but never entirely suppressed. The path ahead narrows as it passes between vineyard walls that allow little room for maneuvering. Here, the donkey's panic reaches crisis proportions. The animal throws itself against the stone walls, desperately seeking escape from invisible danger, crushing Balaam's legs in its frantic attempts to find safety. The physical pain combines with embarrassment at the spectacle his supposedly well trained mount is creating for any observers who might witness such undignified behavior. The beating that follows exceeds anything Balaam has previously administered to the faithful animal. His staff rises and falls with the fury of a man whose professional dignity suffers damage from circumstances beyond his control or understanding. Each blow expresses not only immediate anger, but deeper frustration with supernatural forces that seem determined to prevent his lucrative journey to Moab. Then the impossible happens. The donkey turns its head toward its master and speaks with clear human words that carry reproach and bewilderment in equal measure. "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" The question hangs in the air like smoke from altar fires. Why? Impossible to dismiss, yet equally impossible to accept, according to normal understanding of how the world operates. Balaam's response reveals how completely the morning's frustrations have disrupted his normal spiritual discernment. Instead of recognizing the miraculous nature of communication from an animal, he argues with the creature as if such conversations were perfectly ordinary. "Because you have mocked me. If I had a sword in my hand, I would eliminate you right now." His anger blinds him to the supernatural intervention occurring directly before his eyes. The donkey's reply carries wisdom that exceeds its master's current spiritual perception. "Am I not your donkey, which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Have I ever been accustomed to do so to you?" The question forces recognition that this behavior represents dramatic departure from patterns established through years of faithful service. Something extraordinary must be causing actions so completely contrary to the animal's established character. Only then does divine intervention reveal itself in forms that human eyes can perceive. The angel of the Lord becomes visible to Balaam, standing in the path with drawn sword that would have meant death for any who attempted to pass. The supernatural being that the donkey saw from the beginning now appears to human vision as well, explaining the animal's desperate attempts to avoid what appeared to be certain destruction. The sight drops Balaam face first to the ground in terror and recognition of how close he has come to disaster through spiritual blindness. The angel's words confirm that the donkey's seemingly irrational behavior actually demonstrated wisdom that preserved both their lives. "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely by now I would have eliminated you and let her live." The confrontation reveals layers of meaning that extend far beyond immediate questions of travel and destination. Balaam's reputation as a seer who communicates with divine powers has not prepared him to recognize supernatural opposition when it manifests in unexpected forms. His spiritual pride has blinded him to warnings that a simple animal perceived clearly from the beginning. The very expertise he sells to wealthy clients has become an obstacle to discerning divine will when it conflicts with his professional ambitions. More significantly, the encounter demonstrates that the Hebrew journey toward their promised inheritance operates under divine protection that extends even to preventing their enemies from obtaining supernatural assistance against them. The God who liberated them from Egypt and sustains them in the wilderness also monitors attempts to curse them, intercepting such efforts before they can take effect. Balaam's confession acknowledges both immediate error and deeper spiritual failure. "I have sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the way against me. Now, therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back." Yet the angel's response suggests that the journey may continue, though under conditions that will transform its purpose entirely. "Go with the men, but speak only the word that I will tell you." The divine permission to proceed carries within it the seeds of outcomes completely contrary to those King Balak expects to purchase through his lavish payments. Balaam will reach Moab as planned, but the supernatural intervention that stopped his donkey ensures that his words will serve divine rather than human purposes. The prophet hired to curse will find himself compelled to bless, regardless of his professional obligations or personal financial interests. As the small caravan resumes its southward journey, both rider and mount travel with new awareness of the supernatural forces surrounding their mission. The donkey that saved its master's life through faithful warning returns to normal behavior, having fulfilled its brief role as mouthpiece for divine communication. Balaam rides forward toward wealth and fame, not yet fully comprehending that he travels toward an encounter that will transform his reputation from helpful diviner to unwilling prophet of the very people he was hired to curse. The talking donkey disappears back into ordinary animal existence, but its words echo in memory as testimony to divine power that operates through the most humble means to accomplish purposes that transcend human understanding or manipulation. In saving its master from destruction, the faithful beast has also preserved him for a role in divine drama that will reveal the futility of human schemes opposed to divine will. 3 altars, 3 prophecies, curses turned to blessings. King Balak waits at the border of his territory with barely contained anxiety, his eyes scanning the northern approaches for signs of the prophet he has summoned at such great expense. The Hebrew multitude camps within sight of Moabite settlements now, their presence a constant reminder of the crisis threatening his kingdom's survival. Each day of delay increases the pressure on both diplomatic and military preparations that grow more inadequate as the magnitude of the Hebrew threat becomes clearer. When Balaam finally arrives with his small entourage, the relief in Balak's greeting mingles with frustration at the apparent delay. Did I not urgently send to you to call you? Why did you not come to me? Am I not able to honor you? The king's words carry undertones of desperation, poorly disguised by royal authority. His kingdom's fate may depend on this foreign diviner's ability to neutralize supernatural forces protecting the Hebrew advance. Balaam's response reveals the complications that have already begun to reshape his commission. Behold, I have come to you. Have I now any power at all to speak anything? The word that the divine places in my mouth that I shall speak. The prophet's carefully chosen words suggest that his usual professional autonomy has been compromised by the divine encounter that marked his journey to Moab. Yet both men proceed as if normal divination practices might still accomplish Balak's objectives. The king has prepared elaborate ceremonial arrangements designed to maximize the effectiveness of cursing rituals against the Hebrew people. 3 separate locations have been selected for their strategic and spiritual advantages, each offering commanding views of Hebrew camps, while providing appropriate settings for the complex sacrificial procedures required for major cursing operations. The first chosen site rises high above the surrounding valleys, offering panoramic views that allow visual contact with the entire Hebrew encampment. Here, Balaam directs the construction of 7 altars arranged according to patterns that reflect his understanding of cosmic forces and divine preferences. The number 7 carries sacred significance in multiple spiritual traditions, while the altar arrangement creates focal points for concentrating supernatural power toward specific objectives. The sacrificial requirements Balaam specifies reflect the magnitude of the commission he has accepted. 7 bulls and 7 rams, animals whose value exceeds what most rulers would spend on ordinary religious observances. Each creature must meet exacting standards of physical perfection that demonstrate appropriate respect for the divine powers being invoked. The expense alone signals that extraordinary interventions are being requested through these offerings. King Balak participates personally in the ritual preparations, his presence adding royal authority to ceremonial proceedings designed to impress both human observers and supernatural powers. The smoke rising from 7 burning altars creates a visible prayer that ascends toward heavens, where cosmic decisions about human affairs are made. The scene should inspire confidence in anyone familiar with effective divination practices. Balaam withdraws to a solitary place for the crucial communication phase of the ritual, leaving Balak beside the burning sacrifices to maintain spiritual connection between offering and intended outcome. This separation allows the diviner to receive divine messages without distraction while ensuring that royal presence continues to sanctify the ceremonial site. The arrangement follows patterns that have proven successful in previous consultations throughout Balaam's career. But the message Balaam receives during this spiritual consultation differs completely from anything his professional experience has prepared him to expect. Instead of receiving permission or power to curse the Hebrew people, he finds himself given words of blessing that directly contradict his commission and client's expectations. The divine communication leaves no room for professional interpretation or modification to suit human purposes. When Balaam returns to the altar site where King Balak waits expectantly beside the smoking sacrifices, the prophet's expression reveals that something unprecedented has occurred. The words he speaks carry divine authority that transforms the entire ceremonial context from cursing ritual to blessing pronouncement. From Aram Balak has brought me, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come, denounce the children of Abraham. How can I curse whom divine power has not cursed? And how can I denounce whom the heavenly realm has not denounced? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Behold, a people dwelling alone and not counting itself among the nations. The blessing continues with imagery that celebrates Hebrew uniqueness and divine favor, rather than calling down supernatural punishment upon them. Each phrase adds insult to King Balak's injury by transforming hired cursing into unwilling celebration of the very enemies threatening Moabite independence. The ritual intended to weaken Hebrew resolve through supernatural attack becomes instead a public declaration of their blessed status and divine protection. Balak's response mingles outrage with bewilderment at this complete reversal of expected outcomes. What have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have blessed them indeed. His accusation reflects not only immediate frustration, but deeper confusion about how spiritual forces operate when divine purposes conflict with human desires. Balaam's explanation acknowledges his loss of professional autonomy while attempting to preserve hope for future success. Must I not take care to speak what the divine puts in my mouth? The prophet suggests that perhaps different ritual arrangements at alternative locations might produce the desired cursing results, though his tone carries little confidence in such possibilities. The second attempt follows similar patterns at a new location chosen for different spiritual advantages. 7 altars, 7 bulls, 7 rams, elaborate ceremonial preparations designed to create optimal conditions for supernatural intervention. King Balak participates with desperate hope that changed circumstances might produce changed outcomes, though the first failure has shaken his confidence in the entire enterprise. Again, Balaam withdraws for solitary communion with divine powers, again returns with messages that contradict his commission and client's expectations. The second blessing proves even more elaborate than the first, celebrating Hebrew strength and divine protection, with imagery drawn from nature's most powerful forces. Rise up, Balak, and hear. Listen to me, son of Zippor. The divine is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot reverse it. The declaration continues with descriptions of Hebrew prosperity and divine favor that make mockery of Moabite hopes for supernatural assistance against them. Each word deepens King Balak's humiliation while demonstrating the futility of human schemes opposed to divine purposes. The expensive prophet hired to solve Moab's crisis has become instead a mouthpiece for celebrating Hebrew advantages. Desperate frustration drives Balak toward a final attempt at a third ceremonial site, though his words reveal how completely the previous failures have undermined his confidence. Please come. I will take you to another place. Perhaps it will please the divine that you may curse them for me from there. The king's request acknowledges that divine will rather than human technique now determines outcomes, yet he cannot abandon hope for supernatural intervention without abandoning hope for his kingdom's survival. The third ritual follows the same elaborate patterns: 7 altars, costly sacrifices, ceremonial arrangements designed to maximize spiritual effectiveness. But by now, both participants understand that they are going through motions that divine will has already determined will fail to accomplish their intended purposes. The exercise has become ritual theater performed more from desperation than expectation. Balaam's final oracle surpasses the previous blessings in scope and specificity, describing Hebrew future prosperity and military success in terms that directly threaten Moabite interests. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O children of Abraham. like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the divine has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. The blessing concludes with promises of Hebrew military dominance over their enemies, including specific mention of peoples whose territories border Moabite lands. Each phrase drives home the message that supernatural forces support Hebrew expansion rather than opposing it, that divine purposes include Hebrew success at the expense of current regional powers. King Balak's final response combines rage with recognition that his expensive scheme has failed completely. I called you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have altogether blessed them these 3 times. His dismissal of the prophet carries bitter acknowledgement that supernatural solutions to political problems remain subject to divine rather than human control. The 3 altars fall cold as their fires burn down to ash and ember. The costly sacrifices have accomplished nothing except demonstrating the futility of opposing divine will through human schemes, however elaborate or expensive. King Balak returns to his fortress with empty hands and darkened prospects, while Balaam departs with payment he did not earn through services he could not provide. But the failure of these cursing rituals accomplishes more than their success might have achieved. The public demonstration of divine protection for the Hebrew people strengthens their confidence while weakening their enemies' resolve. The words spoken in attempted curse become prophecy of blessing that encourages Hebrew hearts and troubles Moabite sleep. The 3 prophecies echo across the highlands like thunder from clear skies, carrying messages that reshape regional understanding of supernatural realities. A hired prophet has become unwilling testimony to divine purposes that transcend human manipulation, while expensive rituals have revealed the poverty of spiritual techniques opposed to divine will. Seduction at Shittim. Moab's last trick works. The Hebrew camp at Shittim spreads across the Jordan Valley like a vast city of tents, its orderly rows and careful organization reflecting the discipline that has sustained this people through decades of desert wandering. Here, within sight of the promised land that awaits across the river, the children of Abraham rest and prepare for the final phase of their long journey toward the inheritance their ancestors were promised generations ago. The location holds strategic importance that extends beyond its practical advantages as a staging area for the Jordan crossing. From Shittim, Hebrew scouts can observe the fortified cities of Canaan, while their leaders complete preparations for the conquest campaigns that will establish them permanently in the land flowing with milk and honey. The camp buzzes with anticipation as a people who have known only wilderness prepare to claim agricultural abundance and urban civilization. Yet, this proximity to their goal also exposes the Hebrew people to temptations they have not encountered during their years of isolation in the desert. The settled peoples of the region watch Hebrew preparations with growing concern, seeking ways to weaken or corrupt this formidable nation before it begins claiming territories currently under their control. If direct military confrontation appears futile, perhaps more subtle approaches might accomplish what armies and hired prophets could not achieve. The Moabites, stinging from the humiliation of Balaam's failed cursing rituals, proved particularly creative in developing alternative strategies for dealing with the Hebrew threat. King Balak's advisors recognized that supernatural protection makes the Hebrew people nearly invulnerable to external attack, but internal corruption might compromise that divine favor in ways that foreign enemies could exploit. The plan that emerges from these discussions reflects sophisticated understanding of human weakness and spiritual principles. Rather than confronting Hebrew strength directly, Moabite strategists propose undermining the moral foundations that maintain Hebrew covenant relationship with their protective deity. If the people can be enticed into behaviors that violate their religious obligations, perhaps divine favor will be withdrawn, leaving them vulnerable to more conventional forms of attack. The instrument chosen for this corruption campaign draws upon resources that have proven effective in similar situations throughout history. Moabite women, carefully selected for beauty and trained in the arts of seduction, begin appearing in locations where they will encounter Hebrew men away from the oversight of tribal elders and family structures. These encounters appear accidental at first, chance meetings that develop naturally into friendships and romantic relationships. The women involved in this operation carry instructions that reflect deep research into Hebrew religious practices and cultural values. They understand which behaviors will most effectively compromise Hebrew covenant obligations while seeming to offer genuine affection and companionship. Their approach combines physical attraction with emotional manipulation, creating bonds that make Hebrew men willing to compromise principles they would defend against direct challenge. The religious dimension of this seduction campaign proves particularly insidious in its effects on Hebrew spiritual life. The Moabite women gradually introduced their Hebrew lovers to worship practices associated with Baal of Peor, a Moabite deity whose rituals include elements designed to appeal to physical appetites and emotional needs that desert life has left largely unsatisfied. The transition from romantic relationship to religious compromise follows pathways so subtle that many participants fail to recognize when they cross crucial boundaries. Baal of Peor represents more than just another regional deity competing for Hebrew attention. This god embodies spiritual principles that directly contradict the covenant relationship that has sustained Hebrew people through their exodus from Egypt and survival in the wilderness. Where Hebrew faith demands exclusive loyalty to the divine power that liberated them from slavery, Baal worship encourages divided allegiance among multiple spiritual authorities. More troubling still, Baal of Peor's ritual requirements include practices that violate specific moral commandments central to Hebrew covenant obligations. Sacred prostitution, ritual drunkenness, and ceremonial behaviors that celebrate physical appetite over spiritual discipline create systematic patterns of covenant violation that accumulate like poison in Hebrew spiritual life. The corruption spreads through the Hebrew camp with the viral efficiency that characterizes moral compromise in communities where social bonds have been weakened by prolonged stress. Men who would never have considered abandoning their ancestral faith under normal circumstances find themselves gradually drawn into practices that initially appear harmless, but ultimately require fundamental shifts in religious loyalty and moral behavior. The process unfolds with the terrible logic of incremental compromise that has destroyed nations throughout history. Individual Hebrew men, initially attracted by feminine beauty and companionship, find themselves making small accommodations to please their new lovers. A shared meal that includes food sacrificed to foreign gods, attendance at religious festivals that seem more like social celebrations than serious worship, participation in rituals presented as cultural experiences rather than spiritual commitments. Each step in this progression appears reasonable when considered in isolation, yet together they create a pathway that leads far from Hebrew covenant obligations towards spiritual adultery that threatens the very foundations of their national identity. The women orchestrating this seduction understand exactly how to present each new compromise as a natural extension of what has already been accepted, making resistance seem unreasonable or unnecessarily rigid. The religious leaders, who first recognize the spreading corruption, face challenges that exceed their normal pastoral experience. Unlike external threats that unite Hebrew communities in common defense, this internal moral crisis divides families and tribes as some embrace the new religious practices while others resist with increasing alarm. The very bonds that have held Hebrew society together through decades of wilderness wandering begin to strain under pressures that pit personal desire against communal obligation. Moses receives reports of the growing crisis with the horrified recognition that supernatural protection for Hebrew people depends upon their faithfulness to covenant obligations now being systematically violated throughout the camp. The plagues that devastated Egypt, the miraculous provisions that sustained them in the desert, the military victories that cleared their path toward the promised land, all flow from divine favor that requires exclusive loyalty to the power that liberated them from bondage. The theological implications of the Shittim crisis extend far beyond immediate concerns about Hebrew military readiness or social cohesion. The seduction campaign represents a direct attack upon the covenant relationship that defines Hebrew identity and purpose. By enticing Hebrew men into worship of Baal of Peor, Moabite strategists strike at the spiritual foundation that supports everything distinctive about this people's understanding of themselves and their destiny. Yet the genius of this attack lies precisely in its indirect approach to achieving what direct confrontation could never accomplish. Rather than challenging Hebrew faith through theological argument or military force, the Moabites corrupt it through appeal to appetites and emotions that covenant obligations are designed to discipline and direct. The resulting spiritual compromise appears to emerge from Hebrew choice rather than external compulsion, making it more damaging to communal morale and individual conscience. The festival of Baal of Peor becomes the focal point where private compromises merge into public apostasy that can no longer be ignored or rationalized by Hebrew leadership. What began as individual relationships between Hebrew men and Moabite women culminates in communal participation in religious ceremonies that explicitly reject the exclusive claims of the deity who brought them out of Egypt. The scenes that unfold at these festivals would be shocking to Hebrew observers, even without their religious implications. Sacred prostitution reduces human sexuality to ritual commodity exchange. Ceremonial drunkenness transforms worship into carnival excess that celebrates appetite over restraint. Sacrificial practices include offerings to powers that Hebrew theology identifies as demonic deceptions masquerading as divine authorities. More devastating still is the discovery that Hebrew participation in these ceremonies includes individuals whose tribal positions and family connections make their apostasy particularly scandalous to community observers. When the son of a tribal chief publicly embraces Moabite religious practices, his example carries influence that extends far beyond his personal choices. When respected warriors and successful merchants participate in Baal worship, their involvement suggests that Hebrew covenant obligations may be cultural artifacts rather than divine requirements. The crisis reaches its crescendo when Zimri, a leader among the tribe of Simeon, brings a Midianite woman named Cosbi directly into the Hebrew camp in open defiance of Moses' authority and covenant obligations. This brazen act of public apostasy occurs at the very entrance to the meeting tent where Moses receives divine communications, creating a deliberate confrontation between covenant faithfulness and pagan seduction that demands immediate response. The sight of this open rebellion taking place at the heart of Hebrew religious life triggers responses that reveal how deeply the moral crisis has divided the community. Some Hebrew observers approve of Zimri's bold assertion of personal freedom over religious restriction. Others react with horror at seeing covenant obligations so publicly violated in the very presence of divine holiness. The paralysis that grips Hebrew leadership in this crucial moment demonstrates how completely the seduction campaign has undermined their moral authority and spiritual confidence. Divine anger at this systematic covenant violation manifests immediately in a plague that begins sweeping through the Hebrew camp with deadly efficiency. The supernatural protection that has preserved Hebrew people through decades of wilderness hardship suddenly withdraws, leaving them vulnerable to the kind of devastating disease that can destroy entire populations within days. The connection between moral compromise and divine judgment becomes impossible to ignore, as healthy individuals begin falling sick and dying in numbers that terrify the entire community. Yet even in this crisis, divine mercy provides a pathway toward restoration for those willing to choose covenant faithfulness over personal desire. Phinehas, grandson of Aaron and therefore member of the priestly line responsible for maintaining Hebrew spiritual purity, acts with decisive courage that cuts through the moral paralysis gripping his community. The javelin thrust that eliminates both Zimri and Cosbi represents more than righteous anger at public apostasy. It demonstrates the kind of uncompromising commitment to covenant obligations that divine favor requires from those who would claim status as chosen people. Phinehas risks his own life and reputation to defend spiritual principles that many Hebrew observers have begun treating as negotiable preferences rather than non-negotiable requirements. Divine approval of this decisive action manifests immediately in the cessation of the plague that was devastating Hebrew ranks. The supernatural judgment that threatened to destroy the entire people stops as suddenly as it began, confirming that divine favor returns when covenant faithfulness is restored through leaders willing to take costly action in defense of spiritual truth. The aftermath of the Shittim crisis leaves Hebrew society purged but traumatized by the recognition of how close they came to losing everything through moral compromise that seemed attractive when pursued gradually, but proved devastating when its full implications became clear. The seduction that began with individual relationships had nearly destroyed their national identity and divine protection through a process so subtle that many participants failed to recognize its spiritual significance until disaster struck. King Balak's final strategy against Hebrew expansion ultimately fails like all his previous attempts, but not before accomplishing damage that exceeds what military defeat might have caused. The Moabite seduction campaign succeeds in demonstrating Hebrew vulnerability to corruption while revealing the terrible costs associated with covenant violation. The people who proved invulnerable to external enemies discover their susceptibility to internal moral decay that divine protection cannot prevent without compromising human freedom to choose obedience or rebellion. The lessons learned at Shittim will echo through Hebrew consciousness for generations, serving as cautionary reminder that spiritual warfare often proves more dangerous than physical combat, that seduction can accomplish what strength cannot achieve, that the greatest threats to covenant people come from within rather than without. The Moabite women who nearly destroyed Hebrew destiny through appeal to desire and appetite demonstrate how effectively enemies can corrupt what they cannot conquer. Yet the crisis also reveals divine faithfulness that provides restoration for repentant hearts, even after terrible failures of covenant loyalty. The mercy that ends the plague when righteousness is restored demonstrates that divine love exceeds human failure, while never compromising the holiness that covenant relationship requires. In surviving the seduction at Shittim, Hebrew people learn both their vulnerability to temptation and their access to forgiveness that makes renewed faithfulness possible. The aftermath: vengeance, purging, and a line drawn. The dawn that breaks over the Hebrew camp after the plague's sudden cessation reveals a people transformed by their brush with spiritual disaster. Where yesterday's tents housed families engaged in celebration of newfound prosperity and approaching inheritance, this morning's survivors move through their daily routines with the sobered awareness of those who have witnessed divine judgment firsthand and understood how narrowly they escaped complete destruction. Moses emerges from the meeting tent with the weight of divine communication heavy upon his features. The revelation he has received during the night hours carries instructions that will reshape Hebrew understanding of their relationship with neighboring peoples, particularly those whose seductive influence nearly destroyed their covenant identity. The time for gentle warnings and gradual correction has passed. What follows will demonstrate the severity required when spiritual survival is at stake. The census ordered by divine command reveals the full scope of damage inflicted by the Moabite seduction campaign. 24,000 Hebrew lives lost to the plague represents more than numerical casualty statistics. These were husbands and fathers, sons and brothers, tribal leaders, and skilled craftsmen whose deaths leave holes in Hebrew society that will require generations to heal. Each loss carries ripple effects that touch families and communities far beyond the immediate victims. Yet the plague's victims represent only the most visible consequences of spiritual compromise that infected Hebrew society during their encampment at Shittim. The moral corruption that preceded divine judgment has left deeper wounds in Hebrew consciousness, shattered trust between community members, questions about leadership competency, doubts about divine protection that once seemed absolute and unshakable. The purification rituals commanded by Moses serve purposes that extend beyond ceremonial cleansing to address psychological and spiritual trauma that accompanies recognition of collective moral failure. Hebrew people who believe themselves chosen and protected discover that divine favor carries responsibilities they neglected at terrible cost. The rituals help process grief while recommitting surviving community members to covenant obligations that recent events proved non-negotiable. More challenging for Hebrew leadership is the need to address ongoing relationships between Hebrew men and foreign women that continue despite the catastrophic demonstration of where such connections can lead. The plague eliminated some mixed partnerships through death, but others persist as sources of potential future corruption that threaten renewed spiritual crisis. The decisions required about these continuing relationships test Hebrew commitment to placing covenant obligations above personal desires. The divine instructions Moses receives regarding Moabite responsibility for Hebrew spiritual near disaster carry implications that extend far beyond immediate punishment toward permanent redefinition of relationships between these two branches of Abraham's family tree. The seduction campaign at Shittim crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed, violated trust that cannot be restored, demonstrated enmity that precludes future accommodation or cooperation. The military campaign ordered against Midianite allies who participated in the seduction scheme serves both punitive and preventive purposes in Hebrew divine strategy. Punishment for their role in nearly destroying Hebrew covenant identity through corrupt influences. Prevention of future similar attacks through demonstrating costs associated with attempting to seduce Hebrew people away from exclusive loyalty to their liberating deity. The scope and thoroughness of this military response shocks even Hebrew observers accustomed to divine commands for complete conquest of enemies. Every Midianite male faces elimination. Every married woman shares their fate. Only virgin girls survive as living reminders of divine mercy that operates even within contexts of severe judgment. The harshness of these requirements forces Hebrew communities to grapple with moral complexities that challenge comfortable assumptions about divine character and human worth. Balaam's fate during this campaign provides bitter conclusion to his complicated involvement in Hebrew affairs. The prophet who proved unable to curse them despite lucrative commission from King Balak apparently continued seeking ways to earn Moabite gold through alternative strategies for weakening Hebrew spiritual resistance. His death alongside Midianite leaders confirms that divine protection extends to eliminating threats regardless of their supernatural pretensions or professional reputations. The wealth seized during this punitive campaign exceeds anything Hebrew people have previously encountered in their desert wanderings. Gold and silver, livestock and textiles, weapons and tools, precious stones, and exotic materials. The spoils represent compensation for spiritual trauma while providing resources that will support Hebrew society during their transition from nomadic to settled life across the Jordan. Yet the distribution of this wealth according to divine instructions reveals ongoing concern for maintaining spiritual purity that recently proved so vulnerable to corruption. The metal objects that passed through purifying fire emerged cleansed of associations with pagan worship practices that made them spiritually dangerous. The careful allocation ensures that prosperity gained through judgment serves community rather than individual interests that might recreate conditions favorable to future moral compromise. The aftermath of divine vengeance against Midianite seducers sends clear messages to other peoples who might consider similar strategies for weakening Hebrew advance toward their promised inheritance. The fate of those who attempt to corrupt what they cannot conquer serves as warning that supernatural protection for Hebrew people includes active elimination of threats to their spiritual integrity. Regional powers must choose accommodation or resistance, but seduction is no longer a viable option for dealing with Hebrew expansion. King Balak observes these developments from his highland fortress with growing recognition that all strategies for preventing Hebrew success have failed catastrophically. Military confrontation proved futile against supernaturally protected opponents. Hired cursing transformed into unwilling blessing that strengthened Hebrew confidence while humiliating Moabite pride. Seduction nearly succeeded, but ultimately triggered divine judgment that eliminated Hebrew corruption while purging their enemies with thoroughness that exceeded conventional military defeat. The line drawn in blood and fire around Hebrew spiritual boundaries creates permanent separation between covenant people and neighboring nations that transcends normal political or cultural distinctions. Future relationships will be determined by recognition of Hebrew divine mandate rather than traditional patterns of accommodation and mutual influence. The Moabites and their allies have learned that attempting to corrupt Hebrew covenant identity carries costs that exceed any benefits such corruption might provide. The Hebrew people who survived the crisis at Shittim carry forward lessons that will shape their approach to foreign relationships throughout their subsequent history. The seductive power of compromise, the terrible costs of spiritual unfaithfulness, the mercy available through repentance, and the protection provided by uncompromising commitment to covenant obligations. These truths become part of Hebrew collective memory that influences future generations faced with similar temptations. The purging that follows divine judgment creates space for renewed spiritual growth among Hebrew communities that have been cleansed of corrupting influences through processes both painful and necessary. The survivors understand their vulnerability in ways that make them more rather than less dependent upon divine protection, more rather than less committed to exclusive covenant loyalty that nearly cost them everything, but ultimately proved to be their salvation. The transformation wrought by crisis and judgment prepares Hebrew people for the challenges awaiting them across the Jordan, where they will encounter temptations that dwarf anything experienced during their desert wanderings. The lessons learned through failure at Shittim become foundation for future faithfulness that will determine whether Hebrew occupation of their promised inheritance brings blessing or curse, success or catastrophic failure. As the Hebrew camp prepares for the final phase of their journey toward divine promises fulfilled, the aftermath of Moabite seduction serves as watershed moment that divides their history into before and after categories that can never be reconciled or forgotten. The line drawn by divine judgment creates boundaries that will define Hebrew relationships with surrounding peoples for generations yet to come, ensuring that the crisis at Shittim becomes cautionary tale whose lessons echo through time like thunder rolling across distant mountains. The Moabites retreat to their highlands, carrying knowledge that their most sophisticated strategy for dealing with Hebrew expansion not only failed, but triggered consequences that made Hebrew people more rather than less dangerous as regional neighbors. The seduction that nearly succeeded ultimately strengthened Hebrew spiritual defenses while demonstrating divine commitment to protecting covenant people from corruption, regardless of its source or sophistication. In the silence that follows judgment, both peoples prepare for futures shaped by this encounter in ways neither fully comprehends, but both will remember as the moment when temporary tactics became permanent enmity, when spiritual warfare revealed its true stakes, when divine purposes demonstrated their superiority over human schemes, regardless of their cleverness or desperation. Deuteronomy's warnings. Moab as a symbol of corruption. The sun beats down on the plains of Moab. Moses stands before the people, his voice carrying across the assembled tribes. His words cut through the desert air with the weight of divine command. This is his final sermon, his last chance to warn them. The old prophet's eyes burn with memory. He has seen what Moab can do. The seduction at Shittim still stings like an open wound. 24,000 of his people fell because Moabite women led them astray. Now Moses speaks not just of a nation, but of a pattern, a way of thinking that corrupts from within. Remember what the Moabites did to you, Moses declares. His voice echoes off the nearby cliffs. The crowd listens with growing tension. These are not distant enemies he speaks of. Moab sits just across the river. Their cooking fires can be seen at night. But Moses speaks of something deeper than geography. Moab becomes a symbol in his words. They represent the pride that refuses to bend, the corruption that wears a beautiful face, the rebellion that calls itself wisdom. The children of Lot chose their path long ago. They could have been allies. They could have shown mercy to their distant cousins. Instead, they hired a prophet to curse them. They sent their daughters to lead Israel's sons away from their God. Moses warns against seeking their peace. This command puzzles some who hear it. Why close the door to friendship? Why refuse to make treaties? The answer lies in what Moab represents. Some influences cannot be reformed. Some patterns of thought poison everything they touch. The warning extends beyond politics into the realm of the spirit. Moab embodies the mindset that says human wisdom surpasses divine command. Their culture promotes pleasure over principle. Their gods demand what the true God forbids. As Moses speaks, mothers pull their children closer. Fathers grip their spears tighter. They begin to understand. This is not about hating people. This is about recognizing poison when you see it. Some wells look clean but carry death in their depths. The Moabite way of thinking spreads like yeast through bread. It starts small, a compromise here, a little flexibility there. Before long, the entire community has changed. The boundaries that once protected them crumble away. Moses points across the river toward Moab's territory. Those hills hide altars to Chemosh. Those valleys echo with rituals that make the earth itself cry out. This is what happens when a people choose their own path over the way of their creator. The warning becomes a teaching tool. Future generations will read these words and learn. When they face their own Moabs, they will remember. Some doors should stay closed. Some friendships cost too much. The old prophet's voice grows stronger as he speaks. Age has not dimmed his passion for truth. He has walked with God for 80 years. He has seen miracles and judgments. He knows the difference between mercy and foolishness. Moab had chances to choose differently. When the Israelites asked for safe passage, they could have said yes. When Balak hired Balaam, they could have refused. When their daughters went to Shittim, they could have stayed home. Each choice led them further from redemption. Now they have become something more than a nation. They are a warning, a signpost that reads, "This way leads to destruction." Their very name will remind God's people of what happens when pride rules the heart. Moses finishes his warning as the sun begins to set. The desert grows quiet except for the sound of wind through the camp. Tomorrow they will cross into the promised land. Tonight they remember the cost of compromise. The words sink deep into the hearts of those who hear them. Moab may be just across the river, but they are a world away in spirit. The distance between blessing and curse can be measured not in miles, but in the choices that shape a nation's soul. Ruth the Moabitess, a glimmer of redemption. The fields of Bethlehem stretch golden under the morning sun. A young woman walks between the rows of barley, her hands gathering what others have left behind. Her skin bears the bronze of Moab's desert winds. Her accent marks her as a foreigner. Yet something in her manner speaks of deeper things. This is Ruth. Her story breaks the pattern like light through storm clouds. For generations, the name Moab has meant trouble for the people of Israel. Seduction, corruption, and spiritual poison have marked their interactions. Now comes one who changes everything. Ruth's journey began in tragedy. Famine drove an Israelite family into Moab's territory. Elimelech and Naomi brought their 2 sons seeking food. The land received them, and the sons found wives among the local women. Ruth became part of their household through marriage to Mahlon, but death visited their home with relentless hunger. First, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Then her sons followed their father to the grave. 3 women remained, bound by grief and emptiness. The future stretched before them like a barren field. Naomi prepared to return home to Bethlehem. Reports said the famine had ended. Her daughter-in-law Orpah wept and returned to her people. This made sense. Young women needed families, protection, hope for children. Moab offered these things. Israel offered only uncertainty. Ruth faced the same choice. Logic pointed toward staying. Her people, her gods, her culture all waited in familiar territory. Naomi even urged her to go back. The old woman loved her but saw no future for a Moabite widow in Bethlehem. Then Ruth spoke words that echo through centuries. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." The declaration splits the air like thunder. A Moabite woman chooses Israel's covenant over her own heritage. This choice carries weight beyond personal affection. Ruth rejects everything Moab represents. Their gods who demand child sacrifice become nothing to her. Their culture of pride and rebellion loses its hold. She chooses the harder path toward an uncertain future. The 2 women walk the dusty road toward Bethlehem together. Ruth's decision grows heavier with each step. She leaves behind language, customs, and the familiar rhythm of Moabite life. Ahead waits a people who remember Shittim, who carry warnings about Moabite corruption. Bethlehem receives them during barley harvest. Ruth immediately sets out to work in the fields. Hebrew law allows the poor to gather grain left by harvesters. She bends to gather scraps, 1 handful at a time. Her back aches under the sun, but her spirit stays strong. Providence guides her steps to the field of Boaz. This wealthy landowner notices the foreign woman working among his servants. Her diligence impresses him. Her loyalty to Naomi moves him. Her choice to follow Israel's God transforms his view of what a Moabite might become. Ruth's character shines through daily action. She works hard without complaint. She cares for Naomi with tireless devotion. She shows respect for customs she is still learning. The community begins to see past her foreign birth to the heart within. Naomi recognizes God's hand in these events. She instructs Ruth in the customs of kinsman redeemer. If Boaz will accept the role, he can restore their family line. Ruth must approach him according to Hebrew tradition. Another choice between comfort and commitment awaits. Ruth follows Naomi's guidance with quiet courage. She approaches Boaz at the threshing floor. Her request for protection carries deeper meaning. She asks him to cover her with his wing, using the same word that describes God's protective care. Boaz responds with joy and honor. He praises Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He recognizes her choice of Israel's God over Moab's deities. He sees in her the kind of heart that transforms nations. Their marriage becomes a symbol of redemption extending beyond tribal boundaries. Their son Obed brings joy to Naomi's later years. The women of Bethlehem celebrate the child who will restore their friend's legacy. They declare that Ruth loves Naomi better than 7 sons. The foreign daughter-in-law becomes a source of blessing. Yet the story reaches even further. Obed fathers Jesse. Jesse fathers David. The Moabite woman's choice ripples through generations until it reaches the throne of Israel. The bloodline that once seemed cursed now carries the royal promise. Ruth's transformation speaks to possibilities that seem impossible. Moab, the symbol of corruption, gives birth to Moab, the ancestor of kings. The nation that seduced Israel at Shittim now contributes to Israel's greatest dynasty. Grace writes new stories in the margins of judgment. David versus Moab, judgment returns. The bronze gleams in David's hand as he weighs the sword. Around him, Moabite prisoners kneel in long lines across the battlefield. The king's face shows no emotion, but his eyes carry the weight of justice, long delayed. This is not revenge. This is something deeper. The morning air still carries smoke from the burning cities. David's army has swept through Moab like a cleansing fire. Fortresses that stood for centuries now lie in ruins. The people who once hired Balaam to curse Israel now taste the bitter fruit of that ancient decision. David's connection to this land runs through complex channels. His great-grandmother Ruth came from these hills. Her choice to follow Israel's God changed the course of history. Yet that personal tie does not stay his hand. Some debts transcend family bonds. The measuring line stretches across the ground, dividing the prisoners into groups. 2 portions kneel in the dust, knowing their fate. 1 portion remains standing, granted life through David's mercy. The system seems harsh to modern minds, but it follows the ancient code of divine judgment. Moab's sin reaches back through generations like roots of a poisoned tree. They refused passage to Israel during the wilderness years. They hired a prophet to curse chosen people. Their women led 24,000 Israelites into spiritual adultery at Shittim. Each offense added weight to the scale of justice. The current campaign began with Moabite aggression. King Mesha of Moab had paid tribute to Israel during Saul's reign, but David's rise to power tempted him toward rebellion. He thought the young king would be too busy consolidating power to respond to Moabite independence. He calculated poorly. David's reputation preceded his armies into Moabite territory. The shepherd boy who faced Goliath now commanded the most feared military force in the region. His tactical genius combined with divine favor made resistance futile. City after city fell before the advancing Israelite forces. The Moabite army tried to make a stand at their ancient fortress of Kir-Hareseth. The massive walls had protected them for generations. Their god Chemosh supposedly blessed the stronghold with supernatural power. But human walls cannot stand against divine judgment when the time comes. David's siege engines battered the gates while his archers filled the sky with arrows. The defenders fought bravely, but faced impossible odds. When the walls finally cracked, the flood of Israelite warriors poured through like water through a broken dam. The aftermath required careful handling. David could not simply withdraw after such a victory. Moab needed to understand that their rebellion carried permanent consequences. The measuring line served as both judgment and teaching tool for other nations watching from a distance. Some survived to carry the message back to their scattered communities. Moab would continue as a people, but never again as a major power. Their influence would shrink to the borders they could effectively defend. The days of threatening Israel were finished. The gold and silver from Moabite temples flow into David's treasury. These treasures will help build the temple his son will construct in Jerusalem. Even Moab's wealth serves God's purposes in the end. Nothing is wasted in the economy of divine justice. Chemosh, the god of Moab, remains silent throughout the destruction. His priests offer desperate sacrifices, but no supernatural intervention comes. The contrast with Israel's God becomes stark. When divine favor shifts, human power crumbles like sandcastles before the tide. Word of David's victory spreads throughout the surrounding nations. The Ammonites, Edomites, and Philistines take note. Rebellion against Israel now carries a price none can afford to pay. David's reputation as God's anointed king grows with each military success. The campaign also serves notice to Israel's own people. Faithfulness brings blessing, but disobedience invites judgment. The same God who destroyed Moab for their sins will not tolerate corruption in his chosen nation. David's victories come with responsibility for maintaining righteousness. Years later, when David's own family faces consequences for his moral failures, the king will remember this day. The measuring line that divided Moabite prisoners foreshadows the divisions that will tear his household apart. Justice cuts both ways in God's economy. The survivors return to rebuild what remains of their cities. They remember the day when David's bronze sword reflected the morning sun. They teach their children about the cost of opposing God's anointed. The lesson sinks deep into Moabite consciousness. Moab's power is broken, but their story continues. They will produce pottery and trade goods. They will raise families and tend flocks. But they will never again threaten Israel's security or lead God's people into sin. The chapter of Moabite aggression closes with David's decisive victory. Solomon's compromise. Moabite wives and the slippery slope. The palace gardens bloom with exotic flowers from distant lands. Solomon walks among them as the morning light filters through Lebanese cedars. His wives accompany him, women whose beauty matches the splendor of his kingdom. Among them walks a daughter of Moab, her jewelry catching the sun like captured fire. Wisdom built this kingdom, but wisdom now faces its greatest test. Solomon's heart, once wholly devoted to Israel's God, has begun to divide like a river splitting around stones. The man who prayed for understanding now struggles to understand himself. The marriage began as diplomacy. Moab still held strategic territory along Israel's eastern border. A royal wedding could secure peace better than any treaty. Solomon's advisors praised the political wisdom. The daughter of Moab brought not just beauty, but valuable connections to trade routes. Yet, political calculation opened a door that should have remained closed. Moses had warned against seeking peace with Moab. David had demonstrated why through military conquest. Now Solomon pursues the very relationship his ancestors avoided. The Moabite princess arrives with a magnificent dowry. Camels carry treasures from the eastern desert. Servants bring spices, precious stones, and golden ornaments that rival Egypt's finest craftsmanship. The wedding feast lasts for days, drawing envoys from distant kingdoms. Love grows between the king and his new wife. Her intelligence matches her beauty. She speaks several languages and understands the complex politics of international trade. Solomon enjoys their conversations about philosophy, art, and the management of kingdoms. But love becomes the pathway for deeper compromise. The princess practices the religion of her fathers. She worships Chemosh, the god who demands children be passed through fire. She maintains household shrines where incense burns daily to Moabite deities. At first, Solomon shows only polite interest in her religious observances. He built the temple for Israel's God and still offers the required sacrifices. His devotion seems secure. Yet curiosity begins to undermine conviction as surely as water wearing away stone. The princess explains her gods with passionate eloquence. Chemosh governs war and victory. Astarte brings fertility to crops and wombs. Each deity has a sphere of influence that complements the others. Why limit oneself to just one god when many offer assistance? Solomon begins to attend her religious ceremonies. not as a worshiper, but as a husband showing respect for his wife's traditions. He tells himself this demonstrates political wisdom. International marriages require cultural sensitivity. Surely God understands these necessities. The first altar built outside Jerusalem seems harmless enough. A small shrine on a hill where his wife can worship according to her customs. Solomon provides the materials but does not participate directly. He maintains the fiction that his own faith remains untouched. Other foreign wives notice this accommodation and request similar privileges. The Ammonite princess wants a shrine for Molech. The Sidonian woman desires a place to honor Astarte. Before long, the hills around Jerusalem sprout altars like mushrooms after rain. The irony grows heavy with time. Solomon built the grandest temple in Israel's history for the worship of the one true God. Now he funds construction projects for the very deities Israel was commanded to reject. The contrast escapes his notice as gradual change blinds him. The king's devotion shifts by degrees too small to measure daily. He still attends temple services, but with less frequency. He still offers sacrifices, but with less fervor. The burning passion for God's law cools to lukewarm observance. Younger priests notice the change before the older ones acknowledge it. They see how the king's attention wanders during sacred readings. They observe his increasing absence from holy festivals. They whisper among themselves about the direction of Solomon's heart. The people follow their king's example, as people always do. If Solomon can accommodate foreign gods, why should common citizens remain rigidly exclusive? The boundaries that once protected Israel's spiritual identity begin to blur. Merchants traveling to the hilltop shrines find them convenient places to conduct business. Foreign traders feel welcome in a land that honors their deities alongside the local god. Commerce flourishes, but at a cost few recognize. The rot spreads slowly through Israel's spiritual foundations. Children grow up seeing multiple altars as normal. Young men marry foreign women without considering the religious implications. The nation that once stood apart from its neighbors now blends into the regional religious landscape. Solomon's later years bring increasing darkness. The wisdom that once amazed visiting queens cannot solve the problems his compromises create. The kingdom begins to fragment as different groups pursue their own interests above national unity. The Moabite princess ages gracefully in her palace apartments. Her god Chemosh receives regular offerings from the royal treasury. She has accomplished more than her ancestors who hired Balaam or sent seductresses to Shittim. She has corrupted Israel's greatest king from within his own house. God's patience has limits, even for beloved kings. The divine favor that elevated Solomon begins to withdraw like a tide receding from the shore. The golden age of Israel's kingdom will not survive its founder's spiritual compromise. Chemosh, the dark god of Moab. The altar stands black against the crimson sky. Smoke rises from its surface, carrying the acrid smell of burned offerings toward the desert stars. Children's cries echo off the stone walls as priests in blood-stained robes chant in ancient tongues. This is the worship of Chemosh, and it demands the ultimate price. Chemosh rules Moab with an iron fist wrapped in religious ritual. His name means destroyer in the old tongue, and his followers believe destruction clears the path for new growth. They offer their most precious possessions to secure his favor, believing that sacrifice multiplies blessing. The god's image towers over his worshippers, carved from black stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face bears the features of both man and beast, with eyes that burn like coals in the darkness. His outstretched arms end in bronze bowls where offerings burn day and night. Archaeological evidence from ancient Moabite sites reveals the extent of Chemosh worship throughout their territory. Stone altars mark hilltops from the Dead Sea to the Arnon River. Ceramic vessels bear his symbol, a stylized flame rising from cupped hands. The god's influence penetrated every aspect of Moabite society. Chemosh demands proof of devotion that other gods do not require. Warriors offer captured enemies on his altars before battle. Farmers sacrifice their firstborn lambs at planting time. But the god's greatest desire centers on children, especially the sons and daughters of his most devoted followers. The practice horrifies neighboring peoples, yet Moabites see it as the highest form of worship. They believe Chemosh feeds on the life force of the innocent, growing stronger with each offering. Parents who give their children to the flames receive honor as the most faithful servants of their God. The ritual follows ancient patterns passed down through generations. Priests heat the bronze arms of the statue until they glow red in the darkness. Drums beat in rhythms that match the human heartbeat. The crowd chants prayers that rise in intensity as the ceremony reaches its climax. Mothers bring their infants forward with tears streaming down their faces. They believe this sacrifice ensures their other children will live long lives. Fathers hold back sobs as they place their sons on the burning bronze, convinced that Chemosh will grant them victory in war. The theological framework supporting these practices reveals a worldview fundamentally opposed to Israel's understanding of divine nature. Chemosh represents chaos that must be fed to prevent greater destruction. His followers live in fear of what might happen if they fail to satisfy his hunger. This stands in stark contrast to Israel's God, who provides lambs for sacrifice and stays Abraham's hand when he prepares to offer Isaac. Where Chemosh devours children, the Lord of Israel protects them. Where Moab's God demands death, Israel's God offers life. The Moabite stone, discovered in modern times, preserves King Mesha's boast about his devotion to Chemosh. The inscription describes how the king offered his oldest son to secure victory over Israel. The practice continued at the highest levels of Moabite society throughout their history. Chemosh worship includes fertility rituals that mirror practices found throughout the ancient Near East. Temple prostitutes serve as conduits for divine power, their bodies becoming altars where worshippers seek blessing. These ceremonies blur the line between religion and sexual gratification. The gods' priests wield enormous political power within Moabite society. They control temple treasuries filled with gold and silver from grateful worshippers. They advise kings on matters of war and peace. They interpret omens and predict the future based on sacrificial observations. Yet for all their power, Chemosh's priests cannot prevent their nation's eventual destruction. When Nebuchadnezzar's armies sweep through the region, the god remains silent. The altars that once blazed with offerings grow cold and empty. The destroyer is himself destroyed. The influence of Chemosh extends beyond Moab's borders through trade and intermarriage. Solomon's foreign wives bring these practices into Israel's royal court. The corruption spreads like poison through the nation's spiritual bloodstream, weakening their connection to the true God. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extent of Chemosh worship throughout the ancient world. Clay tablets describe rituals in multiple languages. Tomb paintings depict ceremonies that confirm biblical accounts of Moabite religious practices. The theology of child sacrifice serves multiple psychological needs within Moabite culture. It demonstrates ultimate commitment to their God. It channels parental grief into religious meaning. It reinforces social bonds through shared horror and mutual complicity. The practice also functions as population control during times of resource scarcity. When food becomes scarce, offering children to Chemosh removes mouths to feed while providing religious justification for difficult decisions. Survival and spirituality intertwine in devastating ways. Chemosh represents more than just a foreign god in biblical literature. He embodies the principle that human beings must earn divine favor through increasingly extreme actions. This creates a spiritual arms race where yesterday's sacrifice becomes insufficient for tomorrow's needs. The god's ultimate failure lies not in his cruelty, but in his inability to satisfy the souls of his worshippers. No amount of sacrifice brings lasting peace. No offering purchases permanent security. Chemosh's followers live in constant fear that they have not given enough. Prophets cry out: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and the fall of Moab. The prophet stands on Jerusalem's wall as dawn breaks over the eastern mountains. His voice carries across the city like thunder rolling down from heaven. Isaiah speaks not just to Israel, but to all nations who think they can escape divine justice. His words about Moab slice through the morning air with surgical precision. The oracle concerning Moab, Isaiah begins, his tone heavy with sorrow and certainty. What follows is not anger, but grief over a people who chose their own destruction. The prophet weeps even as he declares judgment, for he sees the end of things before they happen. Isaiah's vision reveals Moab's coming devastation in vivid detail. Cities will fall in a single night. Strongholds that have stood for centuries will crumble like sandcastles. The people will flee their homes, carrying whatever they can salvage from the wreckage of their civilization. The prophet describes refugees streaming toward Zoar, the same city where Lot fled from Sodom's destruction. The connection is not coincidental. Moab's story comes full circle as the descendants return to their ancestors' place of refuge. Geography becomes theology in the prophet's mouth. But Isaiah's oracle contains more than military prediction. He sees the spiritual dimensions of Moab's collapse. Their god Chemosh will be carried into exile along with his worshippers. The deity who demanded so much will prove powerless to save those who served him. The prophet's words reveal God's heart even in judgment. "My heart cries out for Moab," Isaiah declares. Divine justice brings no pleasure when it falls on human beings created in God's image. Even rebellious Moab deserves mourning when they face destruction. Years later, Jeremiah takes up the prophetic burden. His oracle against Moab extends Isaiah's theme while adding new dimensions. The weeping prophet sees not just political collapse, but the end of Moab's entire way of life. Their culture will scatter like leaves before an autumn storm. Jeremiah describes Moab's pride as the root of their destruction. They trusted in their fortresses, their wealth, and their god Chemosh. But human accomplishments crumble when divine patience reaches its end. The prophet warns that no refuge can hide what God has determined to judge. The oracle includes a haunting image of Moab as a broken jar. Once useful for storing precious things, the vessel now lies shattered beyond repair. The metaphor captures both the finality of judgment and the waste of what might have been. Yet even Jeremiah's harsh words contain hints of mercy. In the latter days, God will restore Moab's fortunes. The judgment is not the end of their story, but a painful chapter in a longer narrative of redemption. Hope flickers, even in the darkest prophecies. Amos approaches Moab's sin from a different angle. The shepherd prophet focuses on their treatment of Edom's king, whose bones they burned for lime. This desecration of human remains violates the basic dignity owed to all people, regardless of national origin. The crime reveals Moab's character more clearly than their religious practices. They will stop at nothing to humiliate their enemies, even defiling corpses to make building materials. Such cruelty demonstrates how far they have fallen from God's intention for human behavior. Amos declares that Moab's king will die in the coming judgment. The royal line that hired Balaam and sent seductresses to Shittim will finally face consequences for their actions. Divine justice may be slow, but it is certain. The prophetic oracles against Moab serve multiple purposes within Israel's spiritual education. They demonstrate God's sovereignty over all nations, not just the covenant people. They show that moral law applies universally, regardless of religious affiliation. The oracles also warn Israel about the consequences of adopting Moabite practices. If God will judge Moab for child sacrifice and sexual immorality, he will certainly judge his chosen people if they embrace the same sins. Divine favor does not exempt anyone from moral accountability. The literary artistry of these prophecies deserves attention alongside their theological content. Isaiah uses wordplay that connects Moab's name with mourning. Jeremiah employs metaphors that paint pictures in the listener's mind. Amos delivers his message with the directness of a farmer calling his animals. Historical records confirm the accuracy of these prophetic warnings. Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles describe campaigns against Moab that match the biblical descriptions. The archaeological record shows evidence of destruction layers that correspond to the periods mentioned by the prophets. The emotional tone of the oracles reveals something important about God's character. Justice brings no joy when it requires human suffering. The prophets weep as they speak because they reflect their master's heart. Even necessary judgment carries a cost. Moab's response to these warnings follows a predictable pattern. They dismiss the prophets as foreign troublemakers. They trust in their military strength and political alliances. They continue worshiping Chemosh and expecting his protection. Pride blinds them to approaching danger. The fulfillment of these prophecies validates the authenticity of biblical revelation. When human words prove accurate about future events, they demonstrate divine origin. The fall of Moab becomes evidence that God really does speak through his chosen messengers. The prophetic tradition continues beyond the specific oracles against Moab. Later, writers use these judgments as examples of divine justice in action. The principles established in Moab's judgment apply to all nations and all times. Nebuchadnezzar and Moab's collapse. The dust cloud on the horizon grows larger each day. Moabite watchmen strain their eyes against the desert glare, hoping the reports are wrong, but the evidence mounts with each passing hour. The Babylonian war machine rolls toward them like an unstoppable flood. Nebuchadnezzar's reputation precedes his armies. Jerusalem lies in ruins behind him. Egypt trembles at the mention of his name. The smaller nations of the region have learned to submit or face total destruction. Now, Moab must choose between survival and pride. King Jehoiakim of Moab calls his counselors together in the ancient fortress of Kir-Hareseth. The massive walls have protected them for generations. Surely they can withstand whatever force approaches from the west. The god Chemosh has never failed them in times of crisis. The deliberations continue through the night. Some advisors counsel immediate surrender. They point to the fate of other nations that resisted Babylon's advance. Others argue for defiance, trusting in their desert knowledge and defensive positions. Pride wars against prudence in the royal council. Messengers arrive hourly with updates on the approaching army. The numbers grow beyond believable estimates. Infantry units stretch across the horizon like a dark sea. Siege engines roll forward on wheels that shake the ground for miles around. This is not a raid, but a campaign of annihilation. Chemosh receives desperate offerings as the crisis deepens. The priests burn incense until the temple fills with aromatic smoke. Children cry as their parents lift them toward the bronze arms of their god. Surely such devotion will move the destroyer to act on their behalf. But the altars remain silent as Babylonian scouts appear on distant ridges. No divine intervention materializes to save the people who have served Chemosh for centuries. The god who demanded so much proves impotent when his followers need him most. Nebuchadnezzar's siege tactics follow patterns perfected in previous campaigns. His engineers survey the terrain and identify weak points in Moab's defenses. Earthworks rise like geometric mountains around each targeted city. The methodical approach speaks of absolute confidence in the outcome. The first attacks focus on smaller settlements along Moab's borders. These communities fall within days, their inhabitants either killed or captured. Smoke columns mark the location of burned villages. Refugees stream toward the larger cities, carrying stories of Babylonian efficiency and destruction. Kir-Hareseth becomes the focal point of Moabite resistance. The ancient citadel has never fallen to foreign attack. Its walls rise from solid rock foundations, seemingly impregnable. The defenders believe geography will accomplish what their god cannot. Babylonian siege engines begin their work with mechanical precision. Battering rams pound the gates while catapults hurl stones at the walls. The sound echoes through the desert like thunder that never ends. Day and night, the assault continues without pause. Inside the city, supplies run low as the siege tightens. Water cisterns drain while food stores dwindle. Children cry from hunger while their parents ration the remaining grain. The proud defenders begin to understand what defeat truly means. The priests of Chemosh make increasingly desperate offerings to secure divine intervention. The bronze arms of their god glow red-hot with constant use. Yet the walls continue to crumble under Babylonian bombardment. Faith struggles against the evidence of their senses. A breach finally opens in the ancient fortifications. Babylonian soldiers pour through the gap like water through a broken dam. The defenders fight bravely but face impossible odds. Street by street, the city falls to the advancing enemy. King Jehoiakim makes a final stand in the temple of Chemosh. Surrounded by his remaining guards, he calls on his god for miraculous deliverance. But the bronze statue stands mute as Babylonian soldiers storm the sacred precinct. The king dies beside the altar where he offered his children. The fall of Kir-Hareseth signals the end of organized Moabite resistance. Smaller cities surrender rather than face similar destruction. The nation that once hired prophets to curse Israel now begs for mercy from their conquerors. Nebuchadnezzar's treatment of defeated Moab follows established patterns. The leading citizens march into Babylonian exile. Skilled craftsmen join the workforce building projects in distant cities. The land lies open to settlement by more cooperative populations. The treasures of Chemosh's temple become part of Babylon's vast wealth. Golden vessels join the spoils taken from Jerusalem's temple. The destroyer god's own possessions serve foreign masters in alien lands. Irony completes the circle of divine judgment. Moabite culture begins its final dissolution as families scatter across the Babylonian Empire. Children grow up speaking Aramaic instead of their ancestral tongue. Old customs fade as new generations adapt to foreign ways. The identity that defined them for centuries slowly disappears. Archaeological evidence confirms the thoroughness of Babylonian destruction throughout Moab's territory. Burned layers mark the end of Iron Age settlements. Pottery styles change abruptly as new populations occupy the abandoned sites. The material record validates the biblical account. Some Moabites managed to escape the destruction by fleeing into the Arabian desert. These refugees maintain elements of their culture in scattered tribal groups, but they never again coalesce into a unified nation capable of threatening their neighbors. The silence of Chemosh during Moab's crisis reveals the emptiness of false religion. All the children sacrificed on his altars purchase no protection when judgment arrives. The God who promised victory delivers only defeat. Divine pretense crumbles before divine reality. Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Moab fulfills the prophetic warnings spoken generations earlier. Isaiah's oracle proves accurate in every detail. Jeremiah's predictions come to pass exactly as written. The collapse validates the authenticity of biblical prophecy. The ghost of Moab echoes in the New Testament. The sun sets over the Jordan River as Jesus walks along its banks. Somewhere across those waters lie the ruins of ancient Moab, their cities long since crumbled to dust. Yet the spiritual lessons embedded in their story continue to echo through the ages like voices carried on the desert wind. Jesus himself never directly mentions Moab in his recorded teachings, but the patterns they represent appear throughout his ministry. The pride that destroys, the seduction that corrupts, the rebellion that calls itself righteousness. These themes surface repeatedly as he confronts the religious leaders of his day. The Pharisees embody Moabite pride in their assumption that human tradition surpasses divine command. Like the descendants of Lot, they trust in their own wisdom rather than submitting to God's revealed will. Their careful observance of ritual masks the same spiritual rebellion that once led Moab to hire Balaam. When Jesus cleanses the temple, he confronts the same corruption that infected Israel through Moabite influence. Money changers turn sacred space into commercial enterprise. Religious leaders profit from the devotion of pilgrims. The house of prayer becomes a den of thieves, echoing the spiritual adultery that began at Shittim. The Apostle Paul draws explicit connections between Old Testament warnings and New Testament realities. Writing to the Corinthians, he references the seduction at Baal Peor as a warning against sexual immorality. The same appetites that destroyed 24,000 Israelites threaten believers in every generation. Paul's description of false teachers mirrors the ancient Moabite pattern of spiritual seduction. They promise freedom while delivering bondage. They speak of enlightenment while spreading darkness. They claim to offer life while dealing in death. The methods change, but the underlying deception remains constant. The book of Revelation contains imagery that recalls Moab's ultimate fate. Babylon the Great falls with a crash that echoes through heaven and earth. The woman who seduced kings faces final judgment for her spiritual adultery. The pattern established in Moab's destruction finds its cosmic fulfillment. Peter warns believers about false prophets who will arise within the church itself. These teachers parallel Balaam, hired to curse but constrained to bless. They love the wages of unrighteousness while speaking words that sound spiritual. The Moabite strategy of corruption from within continues in new forms. Jude's brief letter contains one of the most direct New Testament references to this ancient story. He warns against those who have gone the way of Balaam by selling spiritual gifts for material gain. The prophet who could not curse Israel becomes a symbol of religious corruption throughout church history. The genealogy of Jesus contains a stunning reminder of God's grace toward the nations. Ruth the Moabitess appears in the royal lineage, proving that divine mercy can transform even the most unlikely candidates. The woman who chose Israel's God over Moab's deities becomes an ancestor of the Messiah. This inclusion serves as a powerful counterpoint to Moab's general condemnation. Individual choice can override national destiny. Personal faith can triumph over ancestral patterns. Ruth's story demonstrates that no one stands beyond the reach of redemption. Jesus himself embodies the ultimate answer to Moab's spiritual problem. Where Chemosh demanded child sacrifice, Christ offers himself as the final offering. Where Moabite religion promoted fear and uncertainty, the gospel brings peace and assurance. The true God provides what the false gods could never deliver. The parable of the persistent widow contains echoes of Moab's relationship with justice. Unlike the corrupt judge who must be pestered into action, God delights to vindicate his people. The contrast highlights the difference between human systems that can be manipulated and divine justice that flows from perfect character. Paul's missionary journeys take him through regions once influenced by Moabite culture. The gospel penetrates territories where Chemosh once held sway. Churches spring up in lands where children once burned on bronze altars. Light dispels darkness in places that seemed permanently shadowed. The conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch provides a beautiful parallel to Ruth's transformation. Like the Moabitess, this foreign official chooses to follow Israel's God despite his outsider status. Philip's explanation of Isaiah's prophecy opens doors that seemed permanently closed to Gentile participation. Early Christian writers saw in Moab's story a prefiguration of the church's struggle against worldly corruption. The seduction at Shittim became a warning about the dangers of compromise with pagan culture. The fall of Kir-Hareseth illustrated what happens when divine protection is withdrawn. The book of Acts describes how the gospel spreads to the ends of the earth, including regions once dominated by Moab's influence. The Great Commission reverses the ancient pattern of Israel being corrupted by foreign nations. Now Israel's Messiah transforms the nations through his followers. Modern archaeological discoveries in Jordan continue to reveal connections between biblical narratives and historical reality. Christian pilgrims visit sites associated with Moses' final sermon and Ruth's hometown. The physical landscape preserves memories that enrich New Testament understanding. The theological implications of Moab's story inform Christian ethics throughout the New Testament. The warnings against pride, the call for sexual purity, and the emphasis on loyalty to God's covenant all trace their roots to lessons learned through Israel's interactions with the descendants of Lot. Themes in theology: pride, judgment, and surprising grace. The threads weave together into a tapestry more complex than any human artist could design. Moab's story contains layers of meaning that extend far beyond the rise and fall of an ancient nation. Their journey from Lot's cave to historical oblivion reveals patterns that speak to the deepest questions of human existence. Pride emerges as the central character flaw that drives Moab's tragic narrative. From the beginning, they refused to acknowledge their humble origins. Instead of embracing their role as distant relatives of Abraham's family, they chose to see themselves as equals who owed nothing to their cousins. This pride manifested in their refusal to grant passage to Israel during the wilderness years. A simple act of hospitality could have changed everything. Instead, they chose to see Israel's need as an opportunity to demonstrate their own importance. The decision set in motion a cycle of conflict that would span centuries. The hiring of Balaam represents pride in its most sophisticated form. Rather than accepting God's blessing on Israel, Moab attempted to manipulate divine power through professional means. They believed money could purchase supernatural intervention. They trusted in human systems more than divine sovereignty. When direct confrontation failed, pride adapted its strategy without abandoning its goal. The seduction at Shittim proved more effective than military force or hired prophecy. Moab discovered that corruption works where confrontation fails. The lesson would echo through their later interactions with Israel. Divine judgment appears throughout Moab's story, but never as arbitrary punishment. Each consequence flows naturally from the choices that preceded it. God's justice operates like moral gravity, drawing people toward the outcomes their decisions create. The judgment begins subtly with exclusion from covenant promises. Moab could have been part of Abraham's blessing to all nations. Instead, they positioned themselves outside the flow of divine grace. Their rejection of Israel's God meant rejection of Israel's destiny. Military defeat under David represents escalated consequences for escalated rebellion. Moab's continued aggression after the wilderness years demonstrated their refusal to learn from earlier mistakes. David's measuring line measured not just prisoners, but the accumulated weight of national choices. The prophetic oracles against Moab showed judgment reaching its fullest expression. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos all pronounce doom on a people who have exhausted divine patience. Yet even these harsh words contain hints of eventual restoration. Judgment serves correction more than vengeance. Babylon's conquest fulfills the prophetic warnings with historical precision. Nebuchadnezzar becomes God's instrument for executing sentences on a nation that chose destruction over repentance. The fall of Kir-Hareseth marks the end of Moab as an independent political entity. Yet grace threads through the narrative like gold wire through dark fabric. Ruth's story demonstrates that individual choice can override national destiny. Her decision to follow Israel's God transforms her from a symbol of corruption into an ancestor of kings. The inclusion of a Moabitess in David's genealogy reveals divine purpose working through human failure. God's plan proceeds even when human agents rebel against their assigned roles. Ruth's faithfulness compensates for centuries of Moabite faithlessness. Grace also appears in the survival of Moabite people despite their nation's destruction. While their political structure collapses, individuals and families continue to exist. The door remains open for future generations to make different choices than their ancestors. The theological tension between judgment and mercy finds its resolution in the character of God rather than the circumstances of history. Divine justice demands consequences for moral choices, but divine love seeks restoration even for the rebellious. Moab experiences both aspects of God's nature. The pattern established in Moab's story repeats throughout Scripture with other nations and individuals. Pride leads to rebellion, rebellion leads to corruption, corruption leads to judgment, and judgment opens the possibility for grace. The cycle continues because human nature remains constant. Modern readers can identify their own struggles in Moab's journey. The temptation to trust human wisdom over divine revelation appears in every generation. The desire to manipulate spiritual forces for personal benefit never disappears. The pride that refuses to acknowledge dependence on God's grace remains humanity's deepest problem. The story also reveals how entire cultures can drift away from truth through small compromises repeated over time. Moab's corruption began with choices that seemed reasonable in their immediate context. Each generation inherited slightly more distorted values than their parents possessed. Yet individual responsibility persists even within corrupt systems. Ruth proves that personal faithfulness remains possible regardless of cultural environment. Her choice demonstrates that no one is permanently trapped by their circumstances or ancestry. The ultimate message of Moab's story points toward the need for divine intervention in human affairs. Neither political wisdom nor religious ceremony can solve the fundamental problem of human pride. Only grace that comes from outside the system can break the cycle of rebellion and judgment. This theological framework prepares readers for the gospel message that follows in the New Testament. Christ accomplishes what human effort cannot achieve. He provides the righteousness that law demands and offers the grace that love desires. The story that began with Lot's failure finds its resolution in another's faithfulness. Legacy: Moab's place in the eternal story. The archaeological sites lie silent under the Jordanian sun. Tourists occasionally visit the ruins of ancient Kir-Hareseth, their cameras capturing stones that once witnessed child sacrifice to Chemosh. Few realize they stand on ground that shaped the spiritual history of humanity. Moab's physical presence vanished from history over 2 millennia ago. No modern nation claims descent from the people who once hired Balaam and seduced Israel at Shittim. Their language disappeared with their political independence. Their customs dissolved into the broader currents of regional culture. Yet their influence extends far beyond their historical lifespan. The patterns they established echo through Scripture like musical themes that repeat in different keys. Pride, rebellion, seduction, and judgment appear repeatedly in biblical narratives, each iteration deepening our understanding of the original template. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of moral choices. Decisions made in Lot's cave reverberate through centuries until they reach their ultimate fulfillment in Babylon's conquest. No action exists in isolation. Every choice contributes to a larger narrative that extends beyond individual lifetimes. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns in family systems and cultural traditions. Dysfunction passes from generation to generation unless consciously interrupted. Moab's story illustrates this principle on a national scale, showing how entire peoples can inherit destructive patterns from their ancestors. The theological implications reach even deeper than the psychological ones. Moab demonstrates that spiritual rebellion carries cosmic consequences. Their opposition to God's purposes affected not just their own destiny, but the history of redemption itself. Their choices mattered on an eternal scale. Ruth's inclusion in the messianic line provides the most dramatic illustration of divine sovereignty working through human agency. The woman who chose Israel's God becomes part of the genealogy that leads to Christ. Her faithfulness transforms centuries of Moabite opposition into a contribution to redemption. This transformation reveals a central biblical principle about God's ability to write straight with crooked lines. Human failure does not derail divine purpose. Even rebellion can serve providential ends when filtered through sovereign grace. Moab's opposition to Israel ultimately highlights the miraculous nature of Israel's survival. The prophetic literature uses Moab as a symbol that transcends their historical existence. When Isaiah and Jeremiah pronounce judgment on pride and rebellion, they invoke Moab as the archetypal example of what such attitudes produce. The nation becomes a theological concept that applies across cultures and centuries. Early Christian writers saw in Moab's story a prefiguration of the church's struggle against worldly corruption. The seduction at Shittim paralleled the ongoing temptation for believers to compromise with pagan culture. The warnings against Moabite influence became principles for maintaining spiritual purity. Medieval Jewish commentators found in Ruth's transformation a model for genuine conversion to Judaism. Her complete identification with Israel's people and God established the standard for those who chose to join the covenant community. Moab's negative example produced positive principles. Reformation theologians used Moab's story to illustrate the doctrine of total depravity. Despite their advantages as Abraham's relatives, they chose rebellion over righteousness. Their failure demonstrated that human nature requires divine grace for salvation. Natural religion leads to chemosh, not to the true God. Modern missions movements find in Moab's story both warning and hope. The warning concerns the danger of cultural accommodation that compromises essential truth. The hope lies in examples like Ruth, who prove that no people group stands beyond the reach of divine grace. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate aspects of Moabite culture that enrich biblical understanding. The Mesha stela provides Moabite perspective on their conflicts with Israel. Pottery shards reveal details about daily life. Altar foundations confirm the reality of Chemosh worship. These physical remains connect modern readers to ancient realities in tangible ways. The stones cry out with testimony about human choices and their consequences. History becomes personal when filtered through archaeological evidence that survived the centuries. Contemporary Israel includes territory that once belonged to Moab. Jewish settlements now occupy hilltops where Chemosh received offerings. The land that witnessed child sacrifice now raises children who study Torah. Geography tells its own story about redemption and transformation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves along Moab's ancient border, contain fragments that reference their story. These manuscripts, hidden for centuries, emerged just as the modern state of Israel was reborn. The timing seems providential, as if ancient witnesses awakened to testify about eternal principles. Academic biblical studies continue to debate details about Moabite chronology, culture, and theology. New discoveries refine our understanding while confirming the essential accuracy of biblical narratives. Scholarship serves the larger purpose of understanding God's ways with humanity. The story's ultimate significance lies not in historical curiosity, but in spiritual instruction. Every generation faces the same fundamental choices that confronted Moab. Will we trust human wisdom or divine revelation? Will we pursue pride or humility? Will we choose corruption or covenant faithfulness? Moab's answers to these questions shaped their destiny and influenced the course of redemption history. Their choices matter not because they were unique, but because they were typical. Human nature remains constant across cultures and centuries. The legacy extends into eternity through the genealogy that connects Ruth to Christ. The Moabite woman's faithfulness contributes directly to the incarnation of God's Son. Her story proves that no background disqualifies anyone from participating in divine purposes. This eternal perspective transforms how we read Moab's entire narrative. Their opposition to Israel was real and destructive. Their influence corrupted God's people repeatedly. Their pride led to national destruction. Yet even their failure serves the larger story of redemption that culminates in Christ. The final word about Moab belongs not to judgment, but to grace. The people who began in a cave of shame contributed to the royal line that produced humanity's savior. Their story ends not in Babylon's conquest, but in Bethlehem's manger. Death gives way to life. Curse becomes blessing. The last becomes first in the economy of divine love.